Yo, howdy, friends. How are you guys doing? Are you listening to me? Are you listening to me correctly? Is everything good? The sound, the image. Hello, Thomas, Oired. How are you guys doing? I think today is a wonderful day. It's a Saturday, and it's just a perfect time to uh, talk politics, geopolitics, and just do a reaction. Howdy, my man. How are you guys doing? I made some modifications to the chat. I don't know how it looks over here. I think it looks fine, I guess. Early stream, yeah. I wanna do some early streams. I think most people because I have a lot of European viewers or people just from different continents, I think this schedule works fine for everyone. So let's start looking at our subject for today. What if alt-hist? I think that's the name, which I think stands for What If Alternative History. So he's a YouTuber with over 330,000 subscribers. So a big YouTuber. It got recommended to me a few days ago on stream. And he has a lot of interesting videos. What if the Cold War was a normal war? Why the right and the left hate each other? What if Germany was divided after World War II? I mean, Germany was kind of divided after World War II, right? What if the scramble for Africa never happened? We're going to have another Great Depression. That's probably true. What else? The future of ideology. The crisis of the 21st. We just have a lot of good videos. So let's start. What if there was a second American Civil War? Yeah, let's start with that one. Which first I have to look for that. What if America went full colonial? Oh shit. Northern Mexico getting wrecked there, huh? What if Irene and Charlemagne married? That's an interesting. What if Latin America was rich? Oh, dude. I could only dream about that. Yeah, let's do something normal first and then we can get to the messy stuff, you know? Shit, I'm gonna have to Google. I can't find what if there was a second American Civil War. Maybe he deleted the video. Let's start with a short one, right? Let's start with this one. What if the Cold War was a normal war?
The second half of the 20th.
Oh, okay. I gotta fix something. Oh, okay. Yeah. There isn't a second. I'd recommend. What if the South won the Civil War? Okay, gotcha. Got it. Um, Perfect. Let's start with this one.
This is the second in my series of redoing my oldest videos every month, and we have a classic here. This alternate history has been done more times than I can
Hello,
count, and is popular
man.
for
Now
a
we're talking
reason.
about
The Civil War is a seminal conflict
what
in
if
American
alt
history.
hist?
It resolved the age-old conflict between North and South, unified America into a single centralized country instead of a federation of states. It was one of the first industrialized wars ever.
Oh shit! Another good one is what if the Aztecs beat the Spanish?
And it ended slavery. So it really begs the question, What if the South did win the Civil War? What would borders be like? What would culture be like? That is a question of this alternate history. So there are two major points that the South could have won the war, Gettysburg and Antietam. Gettysburg has done too much and so will head with Antietam this timeline. Confederate General Robert E. Lee had a plan called Plan 191. The southern defenses of Washington, D.C., the Union capital, were very heavily defended.
I mean, uh, it's kind of hard. It's very okay. This is completely. It's kind of like those videos that talk about what if Germany could have won World War II, right? It's almost impossible that the South could have won the Civil War. Uh, Talk about the population, the international support that the Confederacy lacked at the end of the war, particularly because, Lincoln talked about the war being about slavery and the Emancipation Proclamation, right? So I just can't imagine the South winning the war, but let's see,
So Lee planned to
even
swing to the
at
north of the
Gettysburg.
city and catch the Union armies off their guard on their northern flank. He would then march in a major northern city like Philadelphia or Baltimore. Then he would cut off the rail lines connecting Washington to the rest of the Union, thus seize Washington and force the Union to sue for peace. This plan would have worked except for one of the
We're
strange
already
chances of
8. That's
history.
true.
A Confederate scout got off his horse and took a leak. This resulted in him dropping the plans out of his pocket. This was later found by Union forces who gave it to General McClellan, who knew the
That is true. France and Britain almost recognized the Confederacy. Particularly, there was one event, I think it's called the Trent Affair, where British diplomats were caught on a Confederate ship. But then the war, Lincoln had the Emancipation Proclamation, and then the war was about slavery. And I think France and Britain didn't really want it to be looked as hypocrites, right? Because they already didn't have slavery, both France and the UK. So that
Confederate plans.
changed
It's
the
moments
war.
like this that are like Joan of Arc when I wonder if God intervenes in history, but my Southern and English ancestors would probably hang me for saying that. He intercepted the Confederates at the Battle of Antietam Creek, which was the best ground for the Union forces. After thick fighting and the bloodiest day in American history, the Confederates were unable to push forward and so pulled back. The
The
Confederates tried to
bloodiest
invade
day
the
in
North a
American
year
history.
afterwards, but were defeated at Gettysburg, and the nail was hammered into the coffin of the Confederacy.
Yeah.
In this timeline, the paper never falls out of the scouts' pocket, and so Plan 191 happens. The Confederates march into southern Pennsylvania unopposed. They catch the Union force off guard somewhere near Lancaster, and the Confederates, able to choose their ground, in the Union force, led by McClellan. For those of you who aren't Civil War nerds, consider yourself very lucky for not having heard of such a weakling loser. I'd guess the Union forces would
Yeah.
lose. If not, it's just a repeat of Gettysburg, which ends this.
I think the South just had a lot of good generals. Not only Robert E. Lee, I think there were more. I don't know their names, but there were some very competent generals. While the Union had the opposite problems, they just had a bunch of shitty generals, including George McClellan. I don't know a lot about him, but the few things I know, it's that he was incredibly incompetent. So, yeah.
Alternate history, so let's assume the Confederates win. The remaining Union forces pull back to defend Philadelphia, the second largest city in the country, and the Confederates seize
I wonder if there's a video by someone, what if the South never seceded? There is. It's just, what if the cotton gin was never invented? True.
Baltimore and Washington.
The cotton gin was this device to make the cotton production easier. I'm not entirely sure what it does, but of course that made slavery a lot more productive, right? It made slaves be worth a lot more money. So,
Washington. People like to say the South could never have won the Civil War because the North had 3 times the manpower, had ridiculously more industry, etc.
I think it was more because there were like 4 million slaves in the South, so I think it
People
was
are
like
wrong.
5 times.
Wars are not won on paper, and the South could have won for a couple reasons. Firstly, the North had clueless generals for the first part of the war. Lee just defeated them
Yeah.
one after the other. I'm looking at you, McClellan. Thank God for General Meade and Grant, who pulled the show together and finally won the war. Secondly, many Northerners didn't see the point in continuing the war. Until the North won the main battles, anti-war
I didn't
sentiment
lose,
was
I merely
growing, and
failed to
before
win.
Gettysburg and Vicksburg, it looked like the
Oversimplified,
pro-peace
yeah.
party would win, again led by our homie McClellan, in the 1864 election instead of the pro-war Republicans. Also, Britain and France vaguely supported the Confederacy. The British were worried the United America would threaten Britain as the dominant world power, and felt that by splitting America in two, they could stop this. The French, meanwhile, were trying to colonize.
Look at this. Look at this little blue speck in Mexico. That's France.
Mexico and were worried that a united America would drive them out. Also, both Britain and France were dependent on southern cotton for their industries, and the Union blockade was strangling
That's
this.
true. That is
However,
true.
the British knew a decision to support the pro-slavery Confederacy would be unpopular, and so wanted to wait until the South won an undeniable victory. Meanwhile,
And that never
France, who was
happened.
much weaker than Britain, wanted Britain to okay any war with the Union before getting involved. This would mean that if the Confederates won an undeniable victory, the British and French would likely support them, likely recognizing them as an independent nation and threatening to attack the Union blockade and possibly bombard the eastern shore of America if the Union didn't acknowledge the Confederacy's independence. So under all these circumstances, the Northern opposition would crumble and the North would be forced to recognize Southern independence and sign a peace treaty. The treaty would likely look something like this. The classic Confederate states would likely gain independence. The Potomac is simply so defensible a line that I don't see the Confederates taking Maryland. Also, losing their former capital would be too hard a point for the Union to concede.
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
not sure about Kentucky. It all depends on whether the Union forces are defeated by Kirby Smith's Confederate forces when they invade Kentucky. Oklahoma, or as it was known then, Indian Country, in which the native tribes mainly supported the Confederacy, would join the Confederacy as well. Missouri tried to join the Confederacy, but it had its own mini-civil war in which the Union factions won.
Oh, really?
Also, Missouri simply juts too far north. It would screw up the whole Union supply lines across the continent, heading west.
First French intervention in Mexico, second in French. Yeah, there were actually two. The first one was kind of silly. The second one was the most famous
What would
one.
become Arizona and New Mexico weren't those states yet. The region was divided north-south, with the Arizona Territory being the southern half and the New Mexico Territory being the northern half. New Mexico was under Union domination and Arizona part of the Confederacy. Actually, after the war, the states were divided east-west, so the Southerners wouldn't be able to get a majority in either, and get an entire state of the West. In this timeline, the Confederates would just get the Arizona Territory. After the Civil War, the Union
Makes
would continue
sense.
to industrialize, much as it did in our timeline. The factors that let the North industrialize would still exist, because after the Civil War in our timeline, the South is frankly economically irrelevant. Some people liked saying the South's reparation payments would be so large the Northern economy would be crushed. This is ridiculous. The North's economy was simply so large that this never could have happened. The North likely wouldn't purchase Alaska from the Russians. The recent shock of losing the war would likely mean that the North wouldn't be feeling very adventurous. The purchase of Alaska was seen as worthless at the time, and the Americans would also be worried the superior British Navy would seize it in the next war. Washington is right across the river from Virginia and the
Okay.
Confederacy, meaning
I
the
could see
Union
that.
likely
Yeah, I
moved
could
its
see that.
capital north for protection. This would likely be Philadelphia, the second largest city in the country, and also the city that was the capital before Washington, which was itself a compromise with the South. Meanwhile, if they put the capital in New York or Boston, the rest of the North would preferably join the Confederacy just to make them shut up. Cotton is a very nutrient-intensive crop, which means the soils get depleted very quickly. This combined with the rapidly growing population meant the South had great land lust. In the 10 years before the Civil War, Southern pirates basically tried to conquer Honduras, Baja California, and Nicaragua. The North didn't play with this, but in this timeline that wouldn't be an issue. The Confederates would colonize and conquer Central American nations like
Whoa.
Cuba, Nicaragua, Panama, and Guatemala. These nations were British client states, producing tropical goods for Britain. But so would the Confederacy be, and the British would probably think the Confederates more.
Yeah, I mean, if we're already talking that France and the UK on this timeline recognize the Confederacy, I mean, they'll probably allow this.
Efficient farmers. Remember when I said the French were trying to colonize Mexico? Well, that really happened. The Emperor of France was trying to put a Habsburg named Maximilian on the Mexican throne.
This is a
The
very
end of the
interesting
US Civil
story.
War meant that the United Union forced them to pull out, thus ending French Mexico. That wouldn't happen in this timeline, especially with the friendly Confederacy.
Oh,
to the
shit.
north. The French would be able to wrestle control of Mexico, albeit unstably due to the sheer size and rough geography of the country. This unstable control, combined with aggressive Confederates to the north, would mean the French would actually sell.
Yeah, this timeline would be terrible for Mexico, okay? Like fucking bad. Because you have very aggressive Confederates in the northern border, pretty much almost all of the border. And then you have the French who are just conquering Mexico. So then you have two hostile powers trying to conquer you.
Mexico to the Confederacy. The Confederate economy likely wouldn't industrialize for a couple reasons. Firstly, agricultural prices were very high in the final part of the 19th century, meaning
Yep.
agricultural nations had no reason to industrialize. This is the trap Argentina and Brazil fell into. The final years of the 19th century would be the golden
Brazil
age of the economy.
particularly. Maximilian was a great dude though. Yeah, he was if you consider that he was a foreigner conquering Mexico, a lot of the Mexicans don't really care because he was a better dude than most of our rulers at the time. So a lot of people are like, well, yeah, he was Austrian and yeah, he was with the French, but he had some good ideas and it's just a really interesting guy.
Along with
But
probably
he
the
was good.
Union. God, the 1890s were a good decade. Also, Southern culture looked down upon industry, seeing it as an ungentlemanly activity and discouraged it. This would mean that Southern entrepreneurs would probably just move north into the Union, where the economic system was simply much better developed. The Southern economy also never had the excess capital for big industry, because all the extra money was simply pumped back into buying more slaves and land. Also, much of the South's climate was simply not conducive to business until air conditioning for large chunks of the year. Finally, small amounts of Southern industry would develop, because the South would be an independent country. This would, however, be
Oh
organized
shit.
near the
He already annexed Baja and a lot of the northern states in Mexico. So okay, well,
Union's industrial areas due to climactic reasons and proximity to the previous Union industrial complexes. So the most industrialized parts of the South would likely be northern Kentucky near Cincinnati and northern Virginia. Slavery
close
would
to
be abolished
Washington
at
D.C.
some
Yeah,
point much later in the 19th century. The global opinion simply turned against slavery to such an extent that it would be in the South's favor to get rid of it at one point, because their British and French allies would simply get so disgusted. In the 1890s, they would likely get rid of slavery and replace it with a horrific apartheid system that wouldn't be that different. That's exactly what the South Africans did when the British forced them to get rid of slavery, but they didn't really want to do it. The North and the South would keep a massive grudge. The North would hugely outnumber the South in population and industry, and the fear of reconquest by the North and the following retributions would terrify the South. Meanwhile, the North would keep an enormous chip on its shoulder against the South for seceding, and knowing its sheer size, would
yeah. I
not
think
forget.
that's a good comparison, comparing the South and South Africa. And I guess the South would probably, I don't know if he's gonna mention this, but would become militarized, would invest heavily, almost like Russia, right? It would invest massive amounts of money to its military because if it didn't, they would fear that they would not exist. Yeah, honestly, I read about the time Maximilian was probably a better ruler in nearly every way than the people fighting against him. Yeah, yeah, he was, and he was so liberal. Then actually, the French didn't work like they were preparing to betray him, or I mean, they left him alone. He wanted to stay in Mexico, so he was a good dude. I am pro Maximilian, but I am not pro Second French Empire. You
The
know.
South could be reconquered. As world politics would become more violent and Byzantine in the lead up to World War I, the North and South would pick different sides. The Confederates would side with the British and French, and thus the Entente, for the
Yeah,
same
like
reasons they
Prussia.
fought
Yeah,
them
a
50 years
militarized
earlier.
state. Yeah.
The ease of trade ties and the British and French worries over the United States growing too powerful. Meanwhile, the United States would side with the Central Powers, mainly as a side against the Confederacy, and the US would have large populations of Germans and Irish, who would support the Central Powers. When World War I would break out, the US would come to fight a two-front war against the Confederacy, French Mexico, and British Canada. The
Shit.
United States would win in the end simply
French
due to its
Mexico.
advantage in manpower and industry. World War I was a war of attrition, which the number of troops and machines you could shove into the trenches was more important than your tactics, honestly. And the United States had its 3 to 4 times advantage in population and a massive industrial advantage. I mean, just look at this 1933 map of industry by US states.
Damn.
Also, remember, a third of the Confederate population would be blacks, who would not be allowed for military service. The US would be able to exploit new technologies like airplanes, tanks, and the like on the
This
level
is
that
interesting because you guys remember how Germany wanted Mexico to get into the war so the U.S. could be distracted. Now the U.S. would be distracted fighting the Confederacy and the British and the French, which is kind of a weird concept, right? Because they were allies in this timeline. But in this timeline, apparently the North or the Union is enemies with British Canada, French Mexico, and the Confederacy. So American troops wouldn't really go to Europe, and that gives a massive advantage to Germany and Austria Hungary because the Russians got out of the war because they had the whole Russian Revolution thing. So I don't know if he's gonna touch on this, but maybe on this timeline, Germany could win World War One.
Simply be impossible for the Confederacy. The US
I'm
siding with the
sorry if you
Central
guys hear
Powers would
some
result
noise,
in
but
them
it's
winning
just
in
my
Europe. The
neighbor's
US troops certainly
motorcycle.
wouldn't be helping the Allied forces at the Second Marne, which you could argue is or isn't decisive, and you will in the comments. The British would be forced to divert troops to protect Canada
I
and
think it
wouldn't be able
was
to pull on
decisive.
Canadian troops. The Allies wouldn't be able to buy American weapons or pull on American debt either. Also, the British would have trouble getting food and raw materials, with both the Yankees and the Germans trolling the
The
Atlantic. This would
Yankees.
result in a worldwide Central Powers victory. In the end, the US, simply due to its massive size, would likely annex the Confederacy in its entirety as well as English-speaking Canada, while making Quebec an independent
Holy
puppet state.
crap.
The US would end up militarily occupying much of the continent, but exhausted from the war. Mexico would collapse into civil war, the native Mexican government seizing power, and the Central American Confederate colonies would likely become a US Banana Republic client state. Meanwhile, the Germans would likely take over their lands in Eastern Europe from the Brest-Litovsk Treaty
Yeah.
and seize some colonies in Africa and New Guinea. The Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires would likely survive. The Japanese, who sided with the Entente, wouldn't take much of a beating and might actually backstab their European allies in exchange for some East Asian colonies when their European allies would be in
Maybe.
freefall.
Probably.
The Ottomans under Ataturk could be able to reform as a Western state. Think of how powerful a modernized Turkey could be with all the oil from the Middle Eastern nations like Iraq and Saudi Arabia.
Wait. Well. I don't really think the Ataturk would come into power if the Ottoman Empire survived. Because that was the whole thing of the Turkish Revolution, right? They lost the war. The British, the French, the Russians, the Italians wanted to take a lot of territory from Turkey. So that caused Turkey to fight its independence war. I don't know how they call it, but a war, right? And the Ataturk was born out of that revolution. So I don't know if he would come into power. I don't know, maybe.
Tribes. Meanwhile, the Austro-Hungarian Empire had plans to reform as a federation of aligned states to make it less an artificial collection of Habsburg marriages. This would result in a civil war with the Hungarians, who would lose the most privileges. However, the Germans would support the Austrian Germans and the Slavs in the Civil War, thus allowing reform.
Yeah, I agree.
Since all nations that lost World War I fell into authoritarianism without exception, this would happen. Russia, with the Germans to
Okay, he was already coming into power because he was the best general who won their World War One battles. Okay, yeah, maybe he came into power. Maybe the Ottoman Empire collapsed into a republic, but it's still as a with a lot of territory. I don't know.
exhaust to intervene.
Yeah, Ottomans
would
and
still let the
Austria-Hungary would still
communists seize
collapse.
power. In general, the more advanced a society, it will collapse into fascism, and the less advanced communism. So Britain and France would turn fascist during the downturns of the 30s. They would ally with the Russian communists, who would also have an enormous chip on their shoulder against the Germans. Of course, without losing the First World War, Hitler would never have risen to power in Germany. The Japanese would likely be working out of their own agency to expand their empire, whatever alliance that means.
Yep. They wanted
World War II would be the
resources.
process of the World War I losers teaming up against Germany. The Germans would be attacked on two sides, by the Russians in the east and the British and the French in the west. The Russians, being terrible at offensives at the start of the war, would fail miserably in the beginning. Meanwhile, the front in the west against the British and the French would bog down without the Americans to help out the Western allies. Also, the Kaiser would honestly be so much better an alternative to Stalin that I can't see why the Russian people would fight hard in this war. The United States, having just swallowed the Confederacy and Canada, and having no real investment in the conflict, would not get involved. I wouldn't be surprised if the ex-Confederates, bitter about losing the
South's
war,
gonna do
would
it
rebel
again.
during World War II and be supported by the English fascists, which would then be crushed. However, the United States, after spending so much blood in defeating the Confederacy, would fall into isolationism. The Germans would eventually defeat the other European powers, as they had in World War I. They would simply control so much more of Russia than our timeline, and the Western powers would lose without America's support. This would make Germany the dominant European power. Meanwhile, the Japanese, waiting for the French, British, and Russians to be humbled by the Germans, would swoop in and steal their colonies. The Japanese would invade British Malaysia, India, and far eastern Siberia, and be victorious.
Yeah, this would be horrible. This would be terrible just because the Japanese and the Germans were at the time, not now, but at the time, just horrible, would dominate Asia and Europe.
This is what this timeline would end up looking like, with the Germans dominating Europe and its colonies. The United States would likely dominate America and Latin America, and the Japanese East Asia.
Yeah, let's look at the map. So you got a massive Ottoman Empire controlling Arabia, Egypt, Sudan, parts of Libya. You got Italy controlling the rest of Libya, France keeping its empire, parts of the North African Empire. Japan getting a huge uh, bits of Siberia, northern China, of course, Manchukuo, Korea, French Indochina, Myanmar, parts of India. And then you have the US controlling most of northern Mexico and Canada, Alaska, anyways. Whew. Well, Germany wouldn't be fascist in this timeline. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I was talking more about the Japanese. Uh, Germany and Japan were already, before they fell to fascism, were all right. Yeah, they were pretty right wing. And Japan, I think Japan, even if they didn't fail to fascism, they would still be ultra nationalists, right? And they would still commit the same atrocities they committed in World War II inside China. But now to the peoples in Southeast Asia, South Asia, Siberia, and same. I mean, Thailand would also try to reconquer French Indochina. Probably true. It's great that Thailand was left alone, dude. They really knew how to play their cards. Ethiopia is also left alone. So hey, the two survivors of the whole colonizing Africa and Asia. Mexico, it's just half of its size. You know, it's just little sad Mexico there. Oh, but yeah, let's finish the
America
video.
and Latin America, and the Japanese East Asia. Whaitifalthist, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed that video...
Okay, well, it's done. Damn. So, what did we learn today? The Confederacy winning the Civil War would have changed a lot of world's history. In World War II, Japan forced Thailand to join them or they'd bomb Bangkok. And they did join Japan, so what if the Norman conquest failed?
This is the
Let's watch. I wanted to watch the Latin America one. Understanding Latin America. Yeah, let's watch that one. Gosh, dude, my fucking neighbor and his motorcycle is annoying as shit. What if Latin America was rich? No, that's not the one. What if the Aztecs beat the Spanish? That's fucking interesting. There we go. Why is Latin America
Latin
poor?
America is one of the most forgotten, ignored regions in the world.
Yeah.
It's not as wealthy or powerful enough to be Europe or the US. It hasn't seen Asia's dynamic growth, and it's not as war-ridden or desperately poor as Africa is. This means that Latin America generally gets left behind in books on politics or history.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
I can't tell you how many politics books I've read that just look at Asia and Europe and the US, or history books that just...
Yeah, dude. Yeah, we're just ignored.
Cover the Spanish conquest of the Aztecs and Incas, and then promptly forget the region existed at all. People from the Eastern Hemisphere generally forget Latin America, or...
Okay, so cartels, housework, communism, poverty, communism, cocaine, jungles with temples and, well, frogs, Machu Picchu, party, no idea, hot guys.
View it as quaint, while Canadians and Americans often look upon it with a combination of horror and condescension. This video is my attempt to explain how Latin America works. It'll look at how Latin America formed, how it's progressed, and where it's going. Let's look at one of the most enigmatic and confusing...
It's interesting, he's including Miami as a part of Latin America.
A region of dazzling diversity and color stretching from Miami to the Arctic.
Miami, yeah, he said it, Miami. How does Latin America work? This is gonna be good,
Civilizations
man.
take millennia to build and have a great deal of struggle and adventure that go into them. Experience some of that with Rise of Kingdoms, a mobile strategy game where you build a civilization.
Out of the Latin American nations, who is the strongest? I hate to say this, but I think it's Brazil, 100%. You know, they have the strongest military, the biggest territory, the strongest economy. Yeah, it's probably Brazil. Yeah, with
With
Mexico at
12
a
different
close,
choices
well,
like
not a
Rome,
close,
China,
but
or
just second
France.
place.
Each
What is
civilization has its
this?
own beautiful civilization, real armies to various million square urban landscapes, in-game crops. Also, participate.
Miami is basically capitalist Cuba. It kind of is, yeah.
In the first video in this series in which I talked about Western civilization, I left Latin America out of that video, which turned out to be a controversial decision in which people keep on asking me why I made that call. The truth is, I don't know or care if Latin America is part of Western civilization. It's sort of like, is turquoise a shade of green or blue? I'm sure some person has a definite answer to that question somewhere, but the only thing I can tell you is that the colors green and blue exist, and there's an area in between that's also a color, and I don't think
Yeah, this is a question I've heard a lot. Is Latin America part of the West? Because for once, it's based on European cultures, that European religions. Most of them are Catholics. They speak Spanish or Portuguese and like some French and Dutch. So, but at the same time, it's obviously very different than Europe or the
argued over
US.
whether
So
or
I don't know.
not
I
this
don't really
blue or
care
green
that
is
much.
worthwhile. Latin America does have certain aspects of Western civilization and certain that don't fit, but I find arguing over definitions takes away from actually looking at things for what they really are by shoving them into
Yeah,
pre-existing
it's
frameworks. The point I was trying to make is that Latin America is complex and different enough from the rest of Western civilization that it deserves a video in of itself to explain it. The US operates similarly enough to Germany that you could use the same basic operating system on both. Meanwhile, you would need to code a completely different expansion pack in order to model how, say, Colombia works. Some of you might say Argentina or Uruguay are similar enough to what southern Italy would be like as an independent country, or Portugal, and that's probably fair, but for convenience sake, we're going to look at them through the prism of Latin America in this video. An interesting thing is the Philippines get
yeah.
reasonably
I don't know. For me, Argentina and Uruguay are part of the West. I don't know if I feel the same. If you if if the West is some racial term, then yeah, sure, maybe. But
be considered a cultural
I
part of
don't know.
Latin America, given that it was colonized by the Spanish for centuries during the same era as Latin America. I mean, the Philippines are named after the 16th century King Philip of Spain, for Christ's
Yeah,
sake. Similarly, the native peoples were tribal farmers at a similar level of development to roughly Colombia. I could probably make a fascinating video using the Philippines to
tell
understand
me
Latin
this doesn't
America,
look like
but the
Mexico.
Philippines is
It
sadly one
does.
of the areas of the world where I know the least history about. There are generally three continental cultural influences in Latin America: the Iberian in the form of the Spanish and Portuguese, the African and native populations. Every Latin American
Yeah, it's Chile by far. Chile has the highest standards of living. I think Costa Rica and Panama have also pretty high standards of living. I mean, it mostly European culture. Mexico has a lot of native influence. Mexico does have a lot of native influence, but when you look at the most important influence, like language and religion, it's pretty it's very European. It's just like some festivities that are native. So that's why I say I don't know if it counts because Argentina has a lot of some native influence. The Mapuches were a pretty important native peoples in the region of Argentina.
country has
So
these influences to differing degrees, with some nearly entirely missing out in the native or African influence, but with Iberian culture being the shared characteristic. How these formed is the topic of the next part of this video.
the
The
conquest.
Spanish conquest of the New World was really impressive in sheer military terms. In many cases, like Pizarro's conquest
What regions of Mexico have the most indigenous peoples? It'd be southern Mexico, like the states of Guerrero, Oaxaca, Chiapas. Those states have by far the highest number of indigenous peoples.
of the Inca, 200 or so Spaniards, with the overlooked help of native allies, were able to conquer an empire of 11 million people. Around 600 Spaniards under Cortez were able to conquer the Aztec Empire, which had roughly the same population as France's of downwards of 20 million people, and whose capital at Tenochtitlan would be the second biggest city in Europe. A couple things allowed this, the first of which is the obvious technological advantages. Much to many people's surprise, the biggest Spanish advantages weren't with guns but with steel and especially horses, which the native fighting styles were in no way adapted for. However, another very important factor was that these native regimes were often really brutal and disliked. Although later Latin American
Yeah, the Aztec Empire was an empire, and a lot of the peoples who weren't Aztec inside that empire didn't enjoy the rulers. I think Argentina, Uruguay, southern Brazil, and maybe Chile are Western in basically every way, not just race, at least in my opinion. Well, the thing is, I have family in Argentina. I've been to Argentina. I don't find it that different from Mexico, to be honest. So that's why I think uh, a lot of the people maybe base it on race because I just don't think Argentina and Mexico are extremely different, right?
nationalist historians have tried to rehabilitate them. The Aztec Empire, for example, was really hated since it was the New World equivalent of Assyria, which used immense brutality to hold down its subject peoples, and the Inca,
Yeah.
although being generally fairly benevolent, expanded too quickly and were already suffering crippling civil wars when the Spanish arrived. The Spanish native allies often numbered 90% of their manpower. Similarly, disease was probably the biggest factor, killing 90% of the native population,
Yeah,
which
this
had no
was
immunity to
this
European
was
diseases within a
the
century of
factor.
European arrival. One of the things you need to understand at the Spanish colonization of Latin America was that it was in many ways an extension of the Reconquista, or the process by which the North Christian Spanish kingdoms colonized the South Muslim ones. It's a little ironic that the last Muslim kingdom in Spain was crushed in the same year as the discovery of the New World by Columbus. This manifests in a bunch of ways. First of all,
Grenada.
for a lot of the wars with the Muslims, the Spanish would gather local ambitious militias together to conquer the Muslim cities without much guidance from the centralized government. These enterprising captains would turn power over to the central Castilian monarchy in exchange for titles of nobility. This was exactly the way in which the Spanish colonized the New World, with the conquistadors acting out of their own free will and acting like private business endeavors. The central Castilian government accumulated this massive New World empire without real effort on their part. It's sort of like if Elon Musk colonized Mars with SpaceX and used his own money and then turned it over to the US government. The largest way the Reconquista played into the creation of Latin America was sheerly through the immense energy and conviction that was done with. While most of Europe was in the Renaissance era of humanism,
I feel the same since I was born in southern Italy and I've been to Argentina and Rio de Janeiro and it wasn't that different either. That's the problem with all these definitions like the West or even Europe, like Spain, for example, is very different than Sweden, right? So is Spain really Europe then? I don't know. In recent centuries, isn't there a huge Arab Christian population in Latin America? Yeah, actually, in the part I live in, the part I was born in Mexico has a huge Arab, particularly Lebanese population. Well, it's not massive, but it is influential. And you can see in my city, my hometown, you can see a lot of Arab shops, Arab food places. It's very interesting.
entertaining naked people and borderline atheism, Spain was still hardcore crusader. The reason people like Cortez or Pizarro didn't declare themselves independent kings upon conquering their massive empires was that there was immense belief in the mission of a united Spain that came from the centuries-long conflict with the Muslims.
Yep.
The Spanish did best in the pre-existingly developed kingdoms in the New World like the Aztecs or Inca. These empires were similar to those of the Bronze Age in the Old World, with highly centralized god-king structures. The Inca Empire, for example, was one of the very few successful communist states in history, with no private property, everyone being assigned jobs, and the
Whoa.
state even assigning brides. The centralized kingdoms provided a central nexus that the Spaniards could easily base their power out of. For example, in Peru, the Spaniards easily first enslaved and then serfed the native population. They just used the governmental structures set up by the Inca to oppress the native peasantry even more. In many circumstances, the Spanish used the native aristocracies, who they recognized as legitimate nobility, to govern their empires. The conquistadors also married into the pre-existing Indian nobility at a really high rate in order to maintain their local legitimacy. All of this meant that the centers of Spanish America were also the native centers and thus Mexico and Peru. It's often shocking that the Spaniards were able to control such massive realms so outnumbered, but you have to remember that the Spanish annihilated the pre-existing cultural leadership by wiping out the indigenous priest classes, who were the teachers, historians, bankers, and community leaders of these societies. Similarly, the Spanish argument was that their god was superior, and that was very heavily backed by the natives dying at 90% rates to disease. With their
Yeah.
belief in their own cultures and leadership neutered, the Indians of the urban societies
It is well known that a lot of the indigenous people were impressed by the Spanish because they had horses they never seen before. They had guns they never seen before. And now all the diseases are wrecking the native population. So maybe the people are like, oh, maybe their God is superior. Maybe Christianity is the way to go. So that's why a lot of the people who survived converted to Christianity in very high rates.
in the New World became quite subservient subjects of the Spanish crown. The non-profitable areas were generally colonized by the church. Conquistadors wanted to become lords with serfs, but lost interest in the areas where that got difficult. The fathers just wanted converts, and it was nice if they got serfs as well, but that wasn't strictly necessary. On the mosquito-ravaged coasts of Venezuela, the deserts of Texas or California, or the grasslands of
A lot of
Paraguay,
churches.
Spanish civilization was largely brought by the church. Brazil and Argentina are largely the exceptions to this. In Brazil, which we'll investigate in more detail, the Portuguese started using it as a way station to sail on their way to the Indian Ocean. Both Argentina and Brazil were settler societies in the mold of the US and Canada, inhabited either by African slaves or white settlers with little Indian influence. The Spanish crown had a social structure with three main power centers with one supreme over the rest, those being the landlords, church, and crown. The landowners were largely the descendants of the conquistadors. In most Latin American countries until around the 1970s, around 12 to 15 families controlled the majority of all the land, and thus large parts of the economy. The Spanish crown gave massive tracts of land to a new nobility, with serfs in exchange for converting them to Christianity. The church, given lots of land and tremendous amounts of power by a very Catholic society that had just defeated the Muslims, became a huge force in Spanish America. It was basically the cultural nexus that
This is
provided
Mexico
the
City,
basic
by the way.
welfare, education, art, banking, leadership, and investment of the Spanish Empire. The church was the most stable organization in society and was also the thing that the Indians trusted the most. Although the Spanish-American church was often brutal and racist, in comparison to the landlords who wanted to enslave the native population, the church stood up for the rights of the Indians and basic human decency. The crown was the most powerful element in Spanish-American society, which was deeply surprising given that the empire was so fucking huge. It would take nearly half a year for orders from the crown to reach a place like Bogota in Colombia, and even longer to reach Manila in the Philippines. Something that's very key to understand at this
Yeah, no, you're right. It was a massive empire, and it was really impressive that they were able to
Spanish
pull
Empire,
this
they were
off.
clearly consciously trying to model the Romans. A mistake I read about in a lot of colonial histories is that they view the Spanish colonial officials as idiotic thugs who were purposely trying to impoverish their subjects. That's not accurate. The Spanish officials were actually remarkably well-educated and intelligent, studying Roman law and Greek philosophy at some of the best universities in the world, but
Yeah,
their understanding of the world
they
was
were.
very different than ours. The Spanish were the last of the old-school empires in Europe. What I mean by that is that before the modern world, most empires were not economically based. Instead, they tried to control their societies through hierarchy. They tried to maintain religious homogeneity in order to maintain social cohesion, centralize power as much as possible in order to maximize their power, try to control trade to support their social
If I am correct, the Spanish colonial system in Latin America was extreme to the point that Spanish people born in Spain were seen as better than Spanish people born in the colonies. You are absolutely correct, my friend. It's just white people born in Spain were superior than white people born in the New World,
hierarchies
which
and build
was
societies
crazy.
as cohesive, supposedly symbiotic hierarchies rather than maximizing freedom. They all trusted that educated gentlemen and nobilities would manage a state better than a bunch of rabble. As of the 16th century, this is how every successful empire in a European gentleman's collective consciousness had been maintained across history, whether the Romans, Persians, Chinese, etc. However, starting right after the Spanish Empire formed, new forms of empire were created.
Okay. Spanish Empire, a stable empire, is made by Catholicism, loyalty to the king, and Spanish landlords. British Empire. We don't care what our subjects do as long as they're enmeshed in our economic system and serve the king's army.
Those based on financial rather than hierarchical power. People were encouraged to work for the empire through market incentives rather than a social superior telling them to do so. Starting with the Dutch and the British and then taking in the French and reaching an apex with the Americans, empires became structured to maximize outputs and freedom of action so that the society could become as efficient and powerful as possible. I once read a book written in the 1940s saying that Mexico was poor and America rich since the Spanish thought one became wealthy by controlling gold and the English thought it was by making stuff. These market-oriented societies absolutely wrecked hierarchy-based empires like the Spanish, Ottomans, Chinese, etc. as time passed. Saying this will prevent me from ever visiting Spain, but it's really more useful to the Spanish Empire as a midpoint between a Muslim empire like, say, the Ottomans, and a country like France. That
Oh,
honestly does make sense given that the most civilized
oh
and developed
shit.
parts of Spain, and the parts most involved in the colonization of the New World, were heavily culturally Arab and Muslim not that long before the colonization of the New World started. The
This is
Spanish imperial
controversial
model was
stuff.
basically exactly the same as the Ottoman, with a colonial warrior noble class ruling over the empire with a unified crusading religion as the source of political legitimacy and a large centralized absolutist monarchy. The native populations were stripped of leadership while the market economy and science were distrusted and attacks on religious authority brutally crushed. But back to the main point that I teased. The Spanish were trying very hard to model the Roman Empire and succeeded in a lot of ways. The biggest similarity is that both used culturally coherent aristocracies to dominate diverse and large regions. A Quechua Indian peasant in the Peruvian Andes shared nothing with a cowboy in Argentina or a Congo-speaking slave in Cuba, but their landlords shared a culture that became Latin America. A wealthy person from Mexico City could immigrate more than 1,000 miles to Lima and experience the exact same culture. This was very different from the British colonies, in which a trip 500 miles north from Baltimore to Boston would take one in an entirely different economic, social, religious model. Until the Revolution, the British colonies distrusted each other
Oh
more
yeah,
than their
this is
mother
so true.
country. The Spanish were trying very hard to imitate the Roman Empire of around 100 AD at its height, but instead ended up pretty similarly to how the Roman Empire worked around 400 with Diocletian's decline. In both of these states, the centralized government was trying too hard to maintain more power over a region than really made sense.
Yeah.
Both states were trying to get Stalin levels of control over their countries when transportation was being done by mule. This resulted in sclerotic bureaucracies which passed lots of legislation that they really couldn't enforce. The Spanish crown sent around 500,000 edicts to America during the colonial era, most of which were irrelevant, didn't work with local conditions, and then ended up being condensed around 7,000 laws that made sense. Spanish America had really complex legal codes, which were in fact so complicated that they were only enforced in the breach rather than to the letter, since that would have just been impossible. This is effects even today, with Latin America known for being one of the most bureaucratic and red tape-based parts of the world, which hurts
Oh yeah. Yeah. This is one of the worst parts about living in Mexico is the bureaucracy. It's just huge. It's just horrible. And if you, for whatever reason, are trying to emigrate to Mexico, you'll find out that it's incredibly hard and bureaucratic.
business terribly. The Spanish crown would
Yeah.
send viceroys to the disparate parts of the empire and have them rule like kings for a couple years. In order to prevent the provinces from becoming too independent of the Spanish crown, none of the top positions were allowed to native-born whites, with those top positions being controlled by Spaniards from Spain
Peninsulares, yeah.
itself. The second someone was born in America, they became a literal second-class citizen. The Spaniards created a system of forced labor and servitude in which Indians and blacks had to work for Spanish nobility. This was pretty similar to Diocletian's Rome, in which a government-based serf economy resulted in profound inequality, a strangling of the market economy, and declining population growth, as so much was extracted from the population that there weren't enough resources for people to have lots of kids. Spanish America expanded really quickly and then faced economic and demographic decay. The borders of Spanish America were roughly the same in 1590 as 1790, and the population of Mexico in 1700 was 4.5 million, or a quarter of what it was under the Aztecs. For example, the little more than 1,000,000 or so people who immigrated to America in the colonial era bred like crazy and had a population of 10 million in 1820. A key point is that Spanish America, like Spain before it, was an urban civilization, unlike British North America that was rural. A couple Spanish landlords would live in the city, extracting resources from the white, black, or native serfs around
Yeah, and
them.
this is you can see the effects of this today. If you go, like, most white people in Mexico, or as we call them, white scans, live in the cities, and you'll hardly find any white people. Like, most people on the countryside in Mexico are always indigenous. And when I say indigenous, I don't mean that they still live the indigenous lifestyle, right? It's just that, they speak Spanish and practice Catholicism. It's just that their ethnicity is indigenous or Native
Speaking to other
American.
elites, well, they shared practically nothing with their serfs, and so the society itself was fairly weak. Something you really need to understand about Latin America is that it, alongside India, are the most multiracial and also ethnically diverse of the main
Yep.
civilizations. In Latin America, a white ruling class installed itself, and then a complex caste system developed with different ethnicities performing different roles in the society. In Venezuela, for example, the Castilian Spanish were the ruling class, the native-born whites controlled a lot of the economic power, people from the Canary Islands were the merchants and artisans, the herders were mixed-race white, black, native, blacks worked in the plantation.
This channel is probably one of the most interesting history channel on YouTube, and we are 12. That is, both of those things are correct. I don't see a lot of people talk about this.
And either mixed race or full blood natives were serfs. I think the most important element for a society's success is social cohesion, and that people trust that the other elements of the society are trying their best, that the rulers aren't cheating the people, and other groups aren't free riding.
Yeah.
Japan and America are both very successful societies that share practically nothing in common except social cohesion. Latin America, meanwhile, is one of the regions in the world that scores lowest on this metric, with Latin Americans not trusting their governments or even neighbors at all. This was accentuated by having different races living together, providing different roles, while having a literal parasitic ruling class and a docile peasant class completely alienated from the modern world. This will have profound effects on the society
this
we'll
is true.
discuss later. A big factor for Latin America is that the peasantry and lower classes were basically not represented at all in the social structure. There was no system of accountability and feedback loop between the lower and upper classes, which turned Latin America into a profoundly aristocratic society. I was once reading a book written in the 1940s which said that your average mid-level Brazilian city would have an opera house and no functioning sewer system, and your average American city would be the opposite. Brazil's sort of a weird twisted mirror to all of this, where the Portuguese government was way more lax than the Spanish, but it did have a lot of similar policies. The Portuguese government banned the printing press, set up massive aristocratic plantations where people brought slaves in to create a complex white-black caste system. At the same time, the Portuguese didn't have as strong a hand as the Spanish did, but you see similar aristocratic results appearing in Brazil as in the rest of Latin America. A lot of this just comes from the economics of sugar slavery, which creates similar results to what happened in Latin America. I mean, look at the Roman Empire, which, as it got higher and higher percentages of slaves, became more similar to how Latin America developed. Two of the most brutal things I ever read in history books were both about Mexican history. The first was Mexico is one of the few nations that when it was born you couldn't tell if it was an abortion or not, and the other was Mexico is an epilogue to the Spanish Empire. Confused? Let me explain. As I tried to explain before, the Spanish government set up Latin America in order for them to administer it directly, and so that the colonies could not act independently. This meant that when the Spanish colonies did get independence, they continually
Okay, so we watched a lot of these on the crowd videos, so
about and failed to
damn, yeah, he was roasting my ass.
When Spain was invaded by France during the Napoleonic Wars around 1810, each of the Spanish-American colonies collapsed into what amounted to civil wars. People often talk about wars of liberation, but they were really normally just brutal race and class wars as the fabric of society fell apart with one local faction supporting the Spanish and the other independents. For example, about 25,000 people died in the American Revolution, while 400,000 died in the Mexican, but both countries had roughly similar populations.
Yeah.
This was since the collapse of Spanish power resulted in a collapse in society in Mexico, while the collapse of British power in America was just normal business. Afterwards, the Latin American nations formed under caudillos or independent cults of personality as their government. These people would normally form factions to back them, often interestingly enough pulling from...
And that's why when we were talking about Maximilian, an Austrian guy ruling in Mexico, a lot of people like him most than the rulers we had, because at least he gave a shit about the country. Unlike these guys that they just wanted to gain more power, more money, more influence.
Tribes as their followers, and then launch themselves into power for a few years until the next dictatorship would gain power. After a couple decades, the countries furthest from the equator pulled themselves out into coherent centralized states, independent from these leaders' personalities. Latin America has always not been very stable, and so political fashions elsewhere manifest really strongly in Latin America, since the aristocratic culture allows cults of personality to manifest really strongly. Political fashions gain currency for a couple decades, allowing some Chad to gain power for him and his buddies, and then another faction sweeps over the region when he can't make real long-term change.
Yeah, this is our former president. This is the old one.
From 1850 to 1920-ish, republics
Oh,
of white
God.
landowners with voters rarely numbering over 10% of the population dominated the region. From 1920 to 1960, the area was dominated by dictatorial nationalist technocracies that were a weird mix of right and left-wing policies. Military dictatorships competed with communists and almost always won from 1960 to 1980. Liberal democracies gained power from 1980 to 2000, followed by a shift to left-wing governments until around 2016, shifting back to further right governments. It would be an exaggeration to say these ideologies don't matter. The countries that supported neoliberalism ended up far better than those that went for communism, for example, but it wouldn't be a horrific exaggeration. For example, in both 1900 and today, the average Latin American had 1/4 the GDP of your average American. The region has been moving forward in the last few decades, forming a real middle class in large cities, for example, but the whole world has also been moving forward really fast, meaning that Latin America has been running very fast to stay in the same spot in relative power in the world stage as it's ever been. In fact, the rise of Eastern Europe and East Asia makes Latin America look downright pathetic and embarrassing. Latin America clearly has problems. Anyone, especially Latin Americans, realize that. They wouldn't be migrating to the US or Spain in the tens of millions if that wasn't the case. Countries like Brazil and Mexico have more annual gun deaths due to crime than deaths in actual war zones like Syria or Iraq. Many Latin American countries like Brazil or Venezuela are in the worst economic conditions in their entire recorded histories now, with millions of the global middle class slinking back into poverty. Why, however?
Why is Latin America
really
poor?
painful answers that people generally don't want to have be answered. The answers that get proposed are generally just demonstrative of what's self-aggrandizing. I will try my best to debunk some of them.
Oh my god, dude. I am scared, guys. I don't want to watch this. Yeah, let's do
try
it.
to propose some better answers. One of the arguments you hear coming out of the right is that there's something inherently wrong with Hispanic culture, that it's too collectivist, Catholic, etc. This is clearly false, given that firstly Spain did quite well once it integrated into the European Union, and that Hispanics have done well inside
my
the
friend.
US. Miami in real terms is culturally part of Latin America, as is the Mexican borderland, and both are quite prosperous. Similarly, you still hear what amounts to the racist argument that Latin America isn't successful since it's brown. This ignores the immense diversity in Latin America. Argentina and Uruguay are whiter than the US and Canada. There also really isn't a correlation for success and skin tone in Latin America. The Argentines in real
Yeah, I mean, because that's interesting, right? Argentina is whiter than the US, but Argentina is doing worse than Peru, for example, than Colombia. So it's not about race.
Just as poor as their neighbors who are dark-skinned and are far worse off than mixed-race Chile. Among immigrant groups in America, the largely white Puerto Ricans are poorer than other darker-skinned groups like the Mexicans. You get the geography argument, which has some validity in that Latin America has had horrific diseases for a lot of its history, massive deserts and jungles. However, you also get Latin American countries like Argentina that have what amounts to a perfect climate, some of the best soil in the world, and a big river system, and they still failed. Also, America was able to get around the South's disease problems,
America does
deserts
have
of the
a
West,
rough
and difficulty farming the Great Plains
terrain
and technological advance.
Canada,
Latin America could have done something similar if it was
Russia,
a more technologically
Sweden.
developed culture. You also hear the argument in the left that Latin America is held back by colonialism and a part of either Europe or America. On the surface level, this does make sense given how Latin America has been economically dependent on other regions, namely Britain before World War I and America since. However, upon scrutiny, it just doesn't hold up. Firstly, when you actually read the history involved, the local elites often welcomed colonial systems. Bolivar was practically simping for the British, for example. Latin America sells raw goods to the rest of the global market and in exchange gets produced goods. There isn't anything oppressive about it. All the partners are voluntary. Almost every economy ever has started with selling raw goods in exchange for produced ones with a more developed economy, but Latin America never progressed beyond it for centuries. The argument generally goes that if an American company would be mining copper in Bolivia, that it would be oppressing Bolivia, but if the Americans weren't there, the copper would never be mined in the first place, making everyone poorer. Similarly, studies have found that greater trade with America and Europe and China actually results in more wealth, not less. The drug trade is a critical exception to this, in which the massive desire for drugs coming out of the U.S. destroyed practically every Latin country within 2,000
that's not the kind of trade you want.
miles. However, to also be fair, if Latin America was already functioning, they'd be able to control the drug trade to a greater degree than they did. The British generally left Latin America alone politically, while the Americans launched a couple pinprick strikes in the Caribbean basin. The CIA gets way more credit than it deserves in Latin America. The destruction of leftists in places like El Salvador, Chile, and Argentina, for example, was almost entirely locally organized, and the US just watched. The US does relatively little in Latin America, especially south of the Caribbean basin, since it just doesn't care, although it does pick factions it wants to win. The US did make some horrific and atrocious blunders, such as the 1952 coup in Guatemala that removed a democratic reforming government, and a 1916 invasion of the Dominican Republic, but there are other points where the US should have intervened and didn't. Haitians, for example, begrudged the US in the 1970s for not removing their tyrannical Papa Doc, and I'm betting most citizens in Cuba and Venezuela would have preferred the US to have a stronger hand. The US has more leniency in Latin America than many people care to admit. America, for example, let Mexico liquidate the American Oil Company in Mexico in the 1930s without raising a hand. America also wanted Castro and allowed
They
him to
almost
seize power in his early
rose
phases
a
for hope
hand.
that he'd reform the country until he became communist and anti-American. The myth that their problems are due to foreign exploitation is very powerful in Latin America and does immense
You have Hugo Chavez reading Noam Chomsky.
harm. Any failed Latin American dictator will just blame their problems on the US or the West to remove responsibility from themselves. Latin America has wasted literal decades blaming America on their poverty, which just mires them in further poverty. The idea that their poverty comes from exploitation is a way of reconciling that many Latin Americans are taught that their nations are rich due to mineral wealth, but that they live poor lives. The truth, however, is that wealth has practically nothing to do with resources, as Switzerland and Japan being wealthy with practically nothing.
Yeah, no, that's true. I think a lot of people in Africa would feel the exact same way because, the Congo, for example, has huge amounts of resources. It's one of the poorest nations in the world. I agree that wealth has nothing to do with natural resources. So I fucking hate that argument. I hate that a lot of people in Mexico don't like the United States because of this argument that, oh, we have a lot of resources, but we are poor because colonialism or the U.S. intervening in our politics. But no, that's not true. I fucking hate that argument. It's bullshit.
And Nigeria and Brazil, with massive resources, being poor shows us. The
Yeah.
truth is that Latin America is poor since there isn't a division between legal, political, and economic power. When the Iberian conquerors came in, they structured everything on an aristocratic basis, concentrating economic power in the hands of the landlords and judicial and political in the hands of the Spaniards who recently came over, who, when the Spanish monarchy fell apart, defaulted onto the landlords. This lack of balance of power has allowed a profound sense of corruption and distrust to permeate Latin America, since there just isn't any competition to behave better. Once power is centralized to this degree, anyone who really tries to change the system gets crushed behind the force of entropy and various weird special interests that don't want things to change. The powerful have no interest in not being corrupt, and so the system rots inside. Revolutions have failed to reach their stated goals in Latin America since generally what happens is that the revolutionaries just fill the shoes of the pre-existing oppressors and change the name since it's so easy and profitable. The revolutions that claim to be wiping out the landlords frankly just became new landlords. It's interesting given that the American stereotype went from the lazy Mexican for when Mexicans were in Mexico to Mexicans being really hardworking and stealing American jobs in America.
Yeah, no,
in Mexico,
that's
one
true.
wouldn't work hard since one wasn't incentivized to, since the
As someone who's lived in Mexico, I can say that Mexicans are extremely hardworking now. The negative stereotype likely came when Mexico was one agricultural caste society, not industrial. Yeah, I can tell you that people here work very, very hard. And blaming others is always bad. Yeah, I don't see the point in blaming other countries for your
landlords would just
failures
steal
as a
it.
state.
Rule of law is the main thing missing from Latin America, and that no one can trust that the law will behave properly, and so people can't be ambitious for fear that someone more powerful than them, whether a government official, local drug lord, or wealthy neighbor, might predate on them. All of Latin America's main issues really spring from the Iberian aristocrats' desire to totally control their societies, turning everyone else into docile serfs. For example, both the Spanish and Portuguese banned, with some exceptions, the printing press in their colonies and tightly controlled the flow of books and ideas. This is part of the reason why Latin America's educational system is so weak, which weakened equality and social mobility. The strongly economically unequal society meant that wealth never trickled downwards to have a capitalist revolution. Similarly, the Iberians discouraged economic innovation with bans on banks and local trade between colonies. Latin America, as in all things, continued the precedent the Spanish set. Spain is a very interesting precedent, since in a lot of ways it was heavily isolated from the rest of Western civilization. Spain purposely missed out on the Enlightenment, scientific revolution, and Reformation. It's an interesting trend in anthropology that colonial
The
societies
Spanish
tend to be extreme
Inquisition,
versions
that's
of the
also a
societies they
thing.
came from, and that's true for Latin America, which in some ways is a parody of the Spain of that era. Spain is also quite interesting economically in that when the North Spanish crown conquered the South in the Middle Ages, they kicked out the productive local Muslim farming class in around the 13th century, replacing them with underpopulated ranch land. Similarly, the Spanish evicted their Jewish and Muslim merchant classes in the 15th century. The Muslim
Yeah.
degree of development was higher than the Christian, and this resulted in economic stagnation as Spain became a highly aristocratic society. Spain in the 15th century was the poorest, least industrialized, and most unequal part of Western Europe, exchanging raw goods for produced ones from the Netherlands and Italy. Again, as we've seen, Latin America took this to an extreme. Interestingly enough, Latin America's lack of wars has been a major liability. Latin America
Huh.
has been consistently
That's
the most
funny,
peaceful part of the
isn't
world
it?
over the last 500 years. This is partially since the countries, for the most part, aren't organized enough to wage massive wars of conquest, but also since the borders here make too much sense. As the opposite of Africa, Latin America's borders make a lot of sense, with most countries being organized around a fertile heartland with some sort of harsh terrain to demarcate a border with another country. The lack of war means that there isn't a great deal of competition between countries that would force them to improve. In a place like Europe, Latin American countries would be torn limb by Germany or France and would either have to reform or die,
Yeah.
but no such desperation exists in Latin America, meaning the countries
I
just
mean,
keep on existing.
if you think about it, Germany became a powerful nation because they had shitty neighbors like France or Russia, and that forced them to build a strong military. And this goes back all to the old Prussian days. So, and Latin America had a few wars, particularly like between Paraguay, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Bolivia, and Peru. Like this region was very problematic, but the rest of the countries didn't have a lot of wars.
If we look at the most successful countries in Latin America, such as Uruguay, Chile, and
Chile.
Costa Rica, they're all the regions that the Spanish government practically forgot about and didn't impose powerful hierarchies on. Hell, the Spanish didn't even acknowledge the existence of Costa Rica or Uruguay. Similarly, all those countries are generally pretty homogenous, with the rulers and ruled being the same ethnic group. More importantly, all these countries have had stable rule of law and democracy, which is what matters. In general, I would say not a lot, but I can figure a way out. The main vector through which in general rule of
What's
law and
the
democracy,
question?
which is what matters.
Does Latin America have any hope?
In general, I would say not a lot, but I can figure a way out. The main
Yeah.
vector through which Latin America could gain institutions is through proximity to the U.S. Tens of millions of Hispanics immigrated to America, and so the connections are strong and getting stronger. Similarly, American industry is relocated to Mexico to an immense degree, industrializing the northern part of the country. This
Yeah.
is the only part of Latin America that's competitively industrialized. This is how societies become more successful almost every time, by proximity, often lasting centuries with other more successful societies. I'm not sure if this is going to work, yet it's the main way I can see Latin America
The mighty Uruguayan Empire.
pulling itself forward. Maybe some genius will be born who can bend the centuries of corruption and parochialism, but that sounds unlikely to me.
Yeah.
Maybe wars will start ripping across the southern cone, forcing mass competition between nations, sparking progress, but I also don't find that likely. Latin America's way forward, in my opinion, is to have Cuba and Mexico industrialized due to American influence and have other Latin American countries try to copy
I
them.
hope.
Whaitifalthist, and thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please...
Holy shit. That was a good video. I don't know. I really enjoyed it. I think that, yeah, the US is going to become a really positive force for Latin America in years to come, especially because now the United States are seeing a trend of uh, non-intervention. For example, the US is getting out of Afghanistan. A lot of people don't like NATO inside the US. So I think the US is more of closing its global bubble. And I think it might focus a lot more in relationships with Canada, with Mexico, and a lot of the neighboring countries in the Americas, and particularly North America, right? This was really good. Yeah, it was really, really good. I really enjoyed the video. It was just super interesting overall. Let's see. I want to watch the why the right and the left hate each other, but how to kill a civilization. Of course, we're gonna have to do another stream to continue watching a lot of the videos because these are super long. What if the Mongol invasions never happened? 5 countries that will collapse by 2040. Let's watch this one: 5 countries that will collapse by 2040.
Much emo-
But guys, I'm gonna take a little break to the bathroom. And yeah, we're 15 viewers. Thank you so much, guy. I think it's not the best time to take a bathroom break, but I just have to do it. But I'll be coming back real soon. Para la próxima semana sí lo hago. I was just watching that. Happy birthday. Let's surprise him while he's in the bathroom. Happy birthday. Happy birthday. Is it really his birthday? No, just joking. I feel like he should watch Why is the World Crazy Right Now before he watches the phone. Video make more sense when watched in order. Okay, yeah. Good suggestion. Let's watch Why is the World Crazy Right Now? The world. There we go. This is the one.
The world has gone insane. Even if that's not what you've said, it's definitely what you've thought. There's a global pandemic. Right-wing populism is sweeping the West, and totalitarianism is spreading across much of the rest. The US and China, after being adequate partners for so long, are now butting heads by every single metric. Racial looting and rioting in America. It seems like wars are on the verge of happening and are a collectible item with exchangeable countries like Turkey, Iran, France, the US, China, North Korea, India, Pakistan, etc. The global climate is getting worse at a rapid pace. For most of us in the West, the world seemed so secure until several years ago, and then everything fell apart with little explanation why. So many things went wrong at such a rapid speed that seemed completely unrelated. The truth is,
Yeah, a lot of what he's saying is true. And now we have the pandemic, and now we have everything going with Russia and Ukraine to add to the tension in Europe.
you could have seen the coming crisis if you knew where to look. In my opinion, most of the issues the world is currently facing are due to 4 root causes. These are things that aren't really under anyone's control that operate over hundreds of years. It's so emotionally satisfying to believe that your one enemy, hopefully with a name with 1 or 2 syllables, is the one to blame for all the world's ills. The Jews, the right, the left, Islam, China. Well, in reality, these are all players struggling in a harsh world outside of their control. My background is history. This comes with certain disadvantages when it comes with dealing with the
Most of his videos are quite episodic and don't need context, but many of his recent videos are part of a larger series. Huh. Well, that's good to know. Man, I'm real scared about the Ukraine thing. I know Russia is acting really aggressive, and I don't know what's going to happen with that, to be honest. Good luck
present
to you
and
guys in
future,
Europe.
but it comes with some immense advantages. I'm used to seeing the world over massive periods, and so I can see what makes our era of history special and not so special at the same time. I'm going to try to use the past to explain the present and what direction we're currently headed in. A final thing, you might think these 4 constellations of reasons makes our era of history special. It doesn't. There are normally many causes for
Have
any
you
single
seen
thing.
Kazakhstan? Yeah, to be honest, I don't see anything happening with Ukraine. I don't know. I don't know anything recent with
That done,
Kazakhstan.
let's move ahead.
Shit, I guess I really missed what's happening in Kazakhstan.
Before we start, if you're getting tired of how crazy this world is, try to escape to one with even more bloodshed and horrors. This video was sponsored by Raid Shadow Legends, a fun fantasy for in Europe. US new game is gorgeous for high logging in. In the description in the next month to get the discount for 100k. Click on this info box inside the game for extra rewards. Start fighting epic battles.
Oh, damn. Kazakhstan is basically becoming a Russian puppet. Huge protest in Kazakhstan right now. Almost a civil war. Russia is sending troops. Russia sent troops. Oh my god.
And crushing your enemies today.
As I guess we can discuss that a little later. In Kazakhstan, there are
Reason 1.
massive riots, and the Russian military went in and has helped the government put down the riots and protests with tanks and everything. There's huge fighting. Oh my god. That's terrible, dude.
Population growth. This is the one biggest variable here by far. We've seen an incredible explosion in global population in the last 80 years. The world's population in 1940 was 2.3 billion, while today it's nearing 8 billion. By historic standards, the world's population only passed 1 billion in the 19th century. In the 1960s and 70s, there was immense worry about mass starvation. Many experts predicted that by 2000, the world would be experiencing crippling famines. This was entirely blocked by the Green Revolution and the development of GMOs, which resulted in a skyrocketing of food production.
Anti-Russian riots are happening right now. If Kazakhstan stops being allies with Russia, then I imagine they will lose the rest of Central Asia, so they have to secure the position over theirs. Wow. We can watch some of those news after this video.
And so the world today is the best fed and richest it's been in all of history by a vast margin. This has been the greatest miracle in human history, feeding 4 times the population in a couple decades. It would be easy to say the population growth had no effect. As a counterpoint, let me bring up the 1968 novel Stand on Zanzibar by John Brunner, which is a sci-fi novel about what the world would be like in 2010 if it had 7 billion people, as it actually did have. Although we got some things wrong, in this book, America has its first African-American president, President Abomi,
Hey,
with the Soviet Union having also collapsed. China replaces it as America's main rival, and class divisions have grown incredibly in America. He also predicted mass shootings, political polarization, powerful multinational companies, dance raves, headphones, video calls, acceptance of bisexuality, and same-sex marriage. What I'm trying to say is that you could have figured out a lot of the present by seeing what effects population growth has in societies. The historian David Hackett Fisher put forth a brilliant theory in his book The Great Wave, which is about 4 cycles of population growth over 1,000 years of Western European history. One of these was in the High Middle Ages.
apparently 40 protesters have been killed and about 18 security forces have died. I found a channel on an app called Telegram and he has lots of videos showing the fightings and aftermath. Some videos are horrific. Oh my god.
Another in the 16th and 17th centuries, another in the late 18th century, and the
Jesus,
final one
that's
starting in the 20th century.
that's
In each of these
terrible.
cycles, as the population went up, you see the same repeating effects in the societies involved. The big variable is that as population goes up, so does competition for resources. The standard of living for the working man goes down. As no government is willing to tell its citizens that they will live worse lives than their parents, every government inflates their currency as much as possible. The economy needs to grow as fast as possible, or everyone individually gets poorer. Inflation always tends to help the wealthy and connected, whose amount of capital allows them to invest in various endeavors, and the amount of their income gives them a buffer. Meanwhile, it erases the smaller wages of the working and middle classes, which creates larger class differences. As the class differences grow and people intuitively realize the pie is shrinking, the upper classes use corruption and their influence with the powerful to protect their privileges, and politics becomes more corrupt. Real estate prices skyrocket as people invest in real things that won't decline in value over time, like money. As the population becomes more desperate, politics becomes more extreme and partisan as centrist candidates aren't solving anything. Traditional culture stops making sense, and so people start to go with more emotional and generally negative cultural and philosophic movements. As the population and thus the governments get more desperate, wars become
After this video, I really want to get into the whole Kazakhstan thing. So if you guys, like the idea, we can, just watch some news videos or check Twitter to see what's going on.
endemic as governments try to break the rules of the peaceful international order in order to hedge it in their favor. The whole system collapses with some spectacular horrors, which lowers the population and breaks the previous social and administrative system. This has come in the form of the Black Death, the crisis of the 17th century, the Napoleonic Wars, and whatever's occurring in the present. In general, it's not often an issue with actual population. If resources were adequately spread, the world would easily have enough resources, but society, class, government, etc. all manage things in manners that are often far from efficient. For example, 17th century Spain could have dealt with its massive poverty and homelessness by exporting its population to the lightly settled colonies in America, but that went against too many vested interests. What happens most of the time is the previous administrative elite is wiped out and a new, more efficient system replaces it after much bloodshed. This occurred with the Renaissance, in the Age of Exploration, the Enlightenment and Scientific Revolution, and the rise of liberalism and the Industrial Revolution, respectively. However, this may be biased towards Western Europe. The ends of cycles have been far less optimistic in other parts of the world. In Eastern Europe, the new forces that replace the old are often just more repressive, and in China, little is learned
Hmm. I think one of these geopolitics videos, I think the wars of the 2020s and 2030s, he predicted conflict in Central Asia. Oh,
from cycle to cycle. Although very few people are starving in the world today, there is struggle due to population growth and resource limitation. We see this in a skyrocketing worldwide prices for real estate. The many water wars that are on the verge of occurring, whether between India and China or Ethiopia and Egypt, among others, or even the global competition for labor that's led to a decline or stagnation of median standard incomes in the first world. Similarly, in each of these cycles, a triggering climactic shift has tended to trigger the final collapse of the previous system. In the last three Western cycles, that was the Mini Ice Age, entering its harsher phases. The French Revolution, Black Death, and crisis of the 17th century were all kickstarted by freezing harvests that left the population decrepit. A similar conclusion could be drawn about global warming, which has already resulted in political instability in the Middle East and the Sahel region. Climate change was likely instrumental in the formation of ISIS, for
it
example.
wouldn't be the only war he predicted, but honestly, predicting wars isn't as hard as it might seem. Holy shit, I think we're gonna watch that one next. I'm just filled with curiosity about the wars of the 2020s and
China's
2030s.
damming up of India's river system, including the Ganges, makes climate-caused wars looking
Yeah,
especially
I've
unpromising
heard
in the
about
near
that.
future. Another important thing to consider is that a reason the Middle East has been so crazy is that this region has seen some of the greatest population growth in history, while the economy hasn't been able to keep up, which creates a large disaffected young population, which just generates instability.
Kazakhstan looked at the US in 2021 and said, "Hold my beer." True.
Africa, which is currently going through a similar process but a few decades later, will likely have a series of horrifying conflicts in the near future. I really didn't do this topic justice. There's so much
Yeah, I'm really scared about the African population boom. It's gonna be scary.
talk about when it comes to population and why the modern world is the way it is and what direction that's going in. I wanted to get more descriptive at how the cycle is related to the present and the enormous effect aging is going to be having on politics in the future, but alas, I need to keep this video a watchable length. Reason 2: the decline of traditional religion.
Oh,
Humans have to believe in something. Purpose is what gives our often unpleasant and miserable lives reason to keep going.
yeah, sorry about that. Apparently, one of the reasons the protest started was that Kazakhstan removed the price cap on fuel. Oh, yeah. Which is an industry that the president's family had a lot of influence on. Damn.
For much of the last 2,000 years or so, much of this purpose came in the form of the traditional religions like Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, etc. However, partially due to technological progress, the world wars, and conscious suicide on the part of the intellectual classes, belief in the traditional religions has been getting weaker, which has created an immense power vacuum inside people's hearts. Every different region in the world is having a different ideological struggle, and it's way too complicated to get into every local variation. But for a brief overview, East Asia is in general having an ideological vacuum. The Chinese Communist Party is trying to fill this by artificially creating its own ideology out of various bits pulled from Chinese history,
To be honest, I don't know how to feel about this because I'm an atheist. So,
combined with loyalty to them.
yeah.
In the Middle East, we're seeing genuine religious wars as Islam is unable to come to terms with being outpaced by its older brother Christianity and the need to basically reform or die. In Europe, this comes mostly in the form of an attack upon the dominant ideology among the elites of welfarism, a term I invented, which basically holds that providing the least hardship to the population is the best policy, and social justice, which needs no explanation, both which are unable to survive in a world with greater competition, in that these ideas were founded upon the presuppositions of security and wealth.
Hmm.
This attack has been mostly done by the traditional right, whose value system is deeply unclear but not explicitly Christian. In the United States, where welfarism and social justice never took hold entirely among the elite, they are locked into a spiral with the previous ideologies of Christianity and liberalism. It's easy to underestimate the importance of this struggle, but it effectively takes on every aspect of American culture, with effectively every topic or possible government policy becoming
Yeah, wearing masks, the nature of gender, flirting.
a new front in the culture war. Make no mistake, these various struggles amount to religious wars. Even if those involved avow with their words that they're atheists or agnostics, they act with religious devotion and treat the morality of their actions and the destiny of their success with religious fanaticism.
Wow. Apparently, in some parts of Europe, there is a rise in native European pagan faiths. That is really interesting. I have no idea why that could be. Yeah, it started with gas, but then turned anti government even after the price cap was returned. The new president was basically appointed by election fraud from the old president from 1990 to 2019.
Stuff like the dialectic of history or the moral arc of history are basically acts of faith, and in my book, if a cat doesn't say it's a cat, but looks and acts like a cat, it's a cat. This happened before in Eurasia from around 500 BC to 300 AD, when you saw growing agnosticism and irreligion, while new religions developed that could fill the void. Once you saw Buddhism, Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, etc. develop, the world fell back to its average state of deep religiosity. What people don't talk about is that there were cults and belief structures that failed and collapsed before those that succeeded showed up. Legalism, the cult of Isis, my buddies Mithraism and Stoicism, Neoplatonism and Manichaeism are all part of that
Yep.
list. I think most of the ideologies that we're dealing with now are going to fall into that category. The main issue is that with the collapse of Nazism and communism, with liberal capitalism's weaknesses having been painfully shown, while social justice is such an orchid, there really isn't much to believe in. This will likely be reconciled by a wave of new religions in the near future. The issue most of the recent ideologies, with Marxism or
Ugh.
Nazism as prime examples
Yikes.
of this, is the desire to put humanity's desires as the guiding hand of morality, and an inability to understand the limits of human nature. In every single regime where morality is being decoupled from an abstract, and whatever is good is in the hands of whatever people say it is, there's always been mass death or complete ineffective apathy. We saw this with the Nazis, communists, Qin Dynasty China, and revolutionary France in the first category, while post-war Europe, the Hellenic states after Alexander, and modern Russia are in the second. The reason these ideologies
Yep.
are so popular is they give the classes that lead them, mostly intellectuals, an immense ego boost and source of power, since it gives them control of morality, lets them change society how they wish by giving them the reins of control over society. This is why Marxism will continually be popular, even though on a factual basis it's been a complete failure. To survive as a civilization and prevent the errors of the 20th century from repeating, we will have to reconcile abstract morality with our inability to prove God, and thus likely inability to continue to design a philosophic system with Him as the center in a world that demands scientific proof for things. This will likely come in many forms that I will have to make a video on at some point. Islam and American Protestantism are very adaptable, and I could easily see them reforming in the near future. Other religions that seem far too wacky to seem realistic now will likely appear
Computer worship, environmental or Gaia worship, internet libertarianism. Oh, okay.
in the next century or
Hey,
few. I haven't even touched on the personal stresses involved. Life is hard, and it's much harder without a clear value system to justify all the suffering involved. When the only reason to live is money and sensory pleasure, as many people believe today, when you don't get those things, your life is meaningless. This is the big reason why, on a national level, there's so much unsustainable debt-based economic growth, since few nations really have any values or greater goals to chase rather than money. Number 3. The dislocations of the information revolution. In
this
our
one, this one is
lifetime,
really
we've
bad.
seen one of the greatest technological revolutions ever. I don't need to tell you about it because you've seen it. I personally think that it's for the better, but of course I would. I'm Gen Z, and so I'm dependent on stuff like GPS to get around and YouTube recommendations for my music, and I run an extremely niche business that could never have existed in any other era. A professional taxi driver who lost his relatively good job due to Uber probably disagrees. This currently reminds me of two eras in history. The first, which was very cleverly shown by historian Neil Ferguson, is Europe after the Gutenberg Press. The rate of growth in the publishing of information has grown in roughly similar proportions after the invention of the internet and the printing press. The invention of the printing press let people with similar ideological views congregate and created new ideologies like Protestantism. People like to think that with greater access to information, people get more tolerant, which isn't true. People in general read what they want to read, and so it lets radicals congregate, which is part of what resulted in the political polarization of the early modern period. A very similar thing is happening online today with people of different political positions. Something else very important that TV started and the internet continued is that it lets people in poorer areas realize how much richer people in other areas are. It used to be that an African peasant would never know how much poorer they were than an average European, or an inhabitant of Rust Belt, Michigan versus Beverly Hills, but now those differences are being rubbed in, creating an unbelievable amount of envy and anger. However, the internet isn't just online. It's affected our physical lives quite a bit at the same
Oh yeah,
time.
a lot.
For example, the advances in robotics have laid off many blue-collar workers. This has created immense social instability. I'm not so worried about this trend lasting much longer. As long as machines would start to replace the jobs of the wealthy and powerful, they will become taboo. I can't see machines replacing lawyers as long as the lawyers write the laws. Also, blue-collar human voters have votes. Machines don't. Even the most authoritarian regimes know that a lazy, purposeless, and unemployed population is the worst recipe for social instability. Similarly,
Oh yeah,
machines have broken
100%.
social ties. I've always lived in the age of technology, but I've gained the impression that social bonds were stronger and more easily manageable before technology. This is backed up by evidence as attendance of all sorts of social groups has declined.
League
We've
bowling.
tried to replace actual social groups with online ones like Facebook, Twitter, or the like. This ignores that humans are inherently social animals, and we've evolved our social functions over millions of years, and so just transplanting one form of social organization completely different from the physical gives few of the same benefits. When you're texting a friend, your brain thinks you're staring at a screen, not talking to a friend. We've all been through quarantine. We all know this is true.
Yeah,
Since humans are inherently social creatures, this has
quarantine has
created an
been rough.
epidemic of loneliness around the world and anxiety as people lose social networks that would provide them support. I get the impression from my travels and conversations that this varies around the world, with generally the areas that are still trying to compete in the global economy,
League bowling is such an American thing. Yeah, it is. In Mexico, league bowling, I don't think it even exists.
like East Asia and North America, having this the worst. We see evidence of this all over our culture, between
Oh
incels, the
no, dude. Yeah. The inso
We see
shit.
evidence of this.
Oh no. I spend hours every single day debating these people on Reddit. Becky, the feminist needy, needs to be dominant one in relationship, average 6 out of 10. The Stacy hates basic bitches like Becky, always had attention. Let's chat dominate. Dude,
All over
this
our
is
culture.
bad.
Between
Yeah.
incels, the Japanese shut ins, most of our music has a generally depressed, lonely vibe now, in so many TV shows at the power of
Big
friendship.
Mouth,
This is one
Modern
of those
Family, yeah.
variables that's almost certainly important, but it's impossible to quantify. When an emotion carries millions of enough people, it generally results in greater social irrationality and desperation. We will almost certainly develop ways to deal with this in the near future, as future generations will become so integrated into technology as to know its limits when applied to human society. Part 4: The Decline of Western Power.
Oh,
I don't know why it's controversial to say the West has been in decline. It's been true by nearly every metric. 100 years ago, the West controlled nearly all the world, was nearly all the world's economy, and was centuries ahead of anyone else developmentally. However, then the European powers killed each other horrifically in the world wars, while Russia turned in.
I'm not sure if I agree with this because, yeah, you could say the West is. How can I put this? You could say, yeah, the West dominated a lot of parts in the world, but at the same time, an average person from Germany or France is doing better today than they were doing 100 years ago. So what's your metric? control over the world or the average well-being of the citizens?
In itself, which meant America was the only Western power remaining. The West decolonized while America, fearing the Soviets and communism, became a superpower, policing the world's oceans and trade routes for free, and
Yep, Cold
ushering in a
War.
golden age of personal freedoms, wealth, and technological progress. A big issue I run into when I try to debate what the future will be like with other people is that they don't understand that this post-World War II golden age is a bizarre aberration. One of the strangest tropes I've found while traveling is the anti-American who's dressed in
Relative
jeans,
decline.
listens to American music, criticizes America with phrases invented by American academics, while their country is independent due to America, and often the social system they
I mean, isn't Europe still the richest continent in the world? It's wealthiest than America, at least per capita. Yeah, they're doing better, but they're not as far ahead as the rest of the world. The West is wealthier today, but the rest of the world is catching up finally. Yeah, I don't see that as a bad thing. The the well-being of its citizen isn't a measure of power or influence. Like, look at Europe. We literally used to rule the world. Yeah, but that's not necessarily a good thing, dude. I mean, m- the West's no longer the only rich part of the world. That's true, but I just don't see that. Okay, okay, let's rephrase it, okay? Uh, I don't know, guys. I mean, yeah, I get the nostalgia from European empires. I get it, but that's not necessarily a good thing. And I don't like China. I don't want China being rich because China is fucking horrible. Okay, but there are parts of the world that deserve to be developed. If you don't dominate, you get dominated. Uh, I I don't know if I agree with that. Because yeah, other parts of the world are becoming wealthier, but America and Europe still have by far the best militaries in the world. So
Advocate
it's all
cannot
relative.
exist without the American strategic umbrella. However, after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was no international threat to the United States, and ironically enough, the American led international order resulted in the creation of China, a state that could rival America. Although the US has many advantages over China, you just can't get over the fact that in a war, America would have to kill 4 Chinese for every American to stay even, numbers which you rarely see in the history of war between countries with rough technological parity. Similarly, considering China's current industrial output, it would almost certainly outproduce America in military materiel. In 1996, Sam P. Huntington wrote a book called The Clash of Civilizations, in which he posited that the dominant political struggle in the world in the new millennium would be that between different civilizations. It sounds sort of suspect and abstract, but the amount he predicted correctly with that paradigm is shocking. He predicted China's militarism, Islamic terrorism in the West, crises over immigration, an American alliance with Vietnam and India against China, Iran and North Korea trying to get nuclear weapons while Russia trying to re-expand into Eastern Europe.
Okay, okay. Like we just watched an entire series about how China is getting fucked when it comes to demographics, the economy, the housing market, its water issues. So if we're talking about threats to the West, China is not it. China is not going to be a massive threat for the West because they have their own problems they have to solve. And those problems are much bigger than anything the US and Europe are facing, okay? Europe and the US don't have a huge housing bubble. Europe and the US don't have huge demographic collapse. Europe and the US don't have a massive water crisis. So, this concept that China is becoming this huge threat to the West, I'm sorry, I don't buy it. And if China is not the threat, what's the other threat, dude? The fucking Congo? No, no, it's just not true. Up until the last 50 years, my ancestors lived in the poorest parts of London and were from poor working class family. Now we're considered lower middle class. Lower middle class, well,
The big force now is that America is pulling out of much of the world's politics, since without
I mean, say that to Australia. Yeah, but Like, how far is China gonna go? Do you think that, let's say China fucking invades Australia? That's not gonna happen. That's never gonna happen. China's like barely gonna enforce soft power uh, to Australia, but they are never gonna go beyond that. Why do you think they haven't invaded Taiwan? And despite being more aggressive with that, they are not gonna invade Taiwan anytime soon.
Communism's international threat, and America becoming oil independent, it is little reason to police the whole world. Peter Zehan's book, The Accidental Superpower, is an interesting summary of this. Since World War II, this has basically frozen borders in place, even in areas where they...
What about Ukraine? Well, yeah, but isn't Russia part of the West? I mean, Russia is a threat, but like what? Russia can't defeat Europe and the US in a war. I mean, that's not going to happen. Whaitifalthist has a video about China, but much of Europe is still having a demographic collapse and having bad housing sector. Is someone that smart leadership can combat if they are actually smart? Yeah, true. Europe will probably have some of the issues that China has, but they are still at a good timeline to solve them. China is having some of those issues, but a lot worse. Russia is not the West. Well, in that case, yeah, maybe Russia is kind of a threat, but like let's say worst case scenario. Russia's not gonna defeat Europe in a war or the US.
like Africa or the
But yeah, okay, you know, I'll be willing to say that Russia is a threat, okay? It is a threat to the West.
If a wannabe Napoleon seized power in Kenya, started to build up his military and invade his neighbors, America would stop him. This seems to be...
Bulgaria lost 11% of their population in 10 years. China is facing demographic crisis in the coming decades because of the one-child laws. They are worried about that now since they allowed 3 children. Yeah, oh yeah, for sure. China has plenty of problems, and everyone acknowledges this and says in some of his videos, but his point still stands. The West is rapidly declining in influence. They have a lot of nukes. Yeah, but using nukes, I don't think the nuke argument is extremely valid, because if you're gonna use nuclear weapons, that means that you're probably gonna get nuked too, and I don't think there's a country that wants to be nuked. If Russia isn't the West, then neither is Ukraine.
Stopping now as America pulls back into its strategic self-interests, which is why countries like Turkey, Russia, China, and Iran are now expanding their influence so rapidly in every direction.
Yeah.
This is the origin of many of the world's conflicts today, as the US is effectively leaving any area that's not in the first world or in the Americas, and people...
Possible future powers according to the Stratford School of Geopolitics. Oh, nice. Mexico, a global future power. Hell yeah.
Need to figure out an actual sustainable balance of power. I'm not...
For me, a Frenchman, I think that the biggest threat to Europe is Turkey, not Russia. Really? Turkey? Why is that, my friend?
Actually saying the U.S.
Ukraine is not the West,
power
Lamau.
Merely one retrenching. It seems likely the U.S. is going through an exceptionally painful period of transition and self-examination, as it has several times.
Okay, understanding Orthodox civilization. We can probably watch that one.
By looking at its position in the world economy, demographics, and technological and social power, the U.S. has been easily holding ground. No matter what, the United States will continue to be an exceptionally powerful country, and a great deal of its power abroad will be determined by America's willingness to go abroad. In summary, a lot of things are causing the current issues. I haven't really given any of these topics any justice, and this really would fit a book format better than a 20-minute video. However, this is what we have. Coronavirus itself is likely a function of population growth, and that populations that grow into the wild encounter wild species that transmit diseases to humans. This occurred with Ebola, the Black Death, Spanish influenza, among others. Globalization caused...
Turkey almost went to war with Greece, like we had to send naval ships to help them. Ottoman Empire Part 2. Yeah. Okay. We are doing a proxy war with Turkey and Libya. Okay, I see where you're going at. Let me think. All right? Because I just watched the video on Nebula about Turkey and Greece and their conflict. And yeah, okay. Turkey could be a threat, but again, Turkey's not gonna defeat NATO. Yeah, what I really think Turkey is a future superpower. And in Syria, yeah, the whole Syria, yeah, I definitely see the Turkish influence in Syria. Turkey is a future superpower. Yeah, probably, probably.
By the American strategic umbrella and population growth, which created unhygienic slums around the world, exacerbated the disease. All of the issues involved have been accentuated by coronavirus. I think the perfect
Turkey is
encapsulation
in
of
NATO. Yeah, that's the thing. Turkey's in NATO. Do you think Turkey is gonna risk it by going to war with Greece because a bunch of islands and maritime borders? In France, we are really not pro NATO though. Oh, really? Is that the case? Turkey got to deal with their inflation first. That is true.
many of these variables is the American school shooter. School shootings started due to the decline in American industrial jobs. It started as a
This
function
is
of
fucked
greater
up, dude.
international competition that was caused in large part by population growth, while at the same time not having any ideology to justify their economic failures, while not having a social network that would support them in their psychological struggles, while the media makes them famous due to the information revolution that just provokes more of them. You can't just blame guns. Americans have always had a lot of them. School shootings are just
Emmanuel Macron said NATO was brain dead. Holy shit.
in the last 40 years. Well, that's it. If you liked that video, please like, comment, subscribe, or
All right, holy crap. Holy fucking shit. You guys are really into the West, huh? Belarus has also been causing issues on the eastern borders of the EU since they are using migrants to destabilize Poland, but Polish are standing strong. US and China going to war is pretty much impossible since Chinese-owned companies have trillions invested in real estate and vice versa. Yeah, I would totally agree with that. China and the US have massive economic links that can't be broken, and any war between China and the US is simply not worth it for both countries. What if it talks next about the next video? Oh god, dude, this video was depressing. I wanted to watch the war videos. Okay, so we just watched Why is the world crazy right now? What if Europe was wiped out by the Black Death? What if the Cold War went new? Okay, let's watch this one, right? War of the 2020s and 2030s. Holy crap. This is gonna be not good.
The last 80 years have been called the Long Peace, in that since the Second World War,
You will have to look up the wars of the 20s and 30s because it's a bit older. Oh, never mind. Yeah. Okay, perfect.
been no major wars between important
Let's
industrialized countries. This is not the norm. The history of the world is effectively the history of war. Nearly all the countries in history have been in a permanent state of waging war or preparing for the next war. The periods of peace, whether the Pax Romana or the long peace of the 19th century, have been precious respites, normally caused by one military power being so preeminent as
some of the wars he predicted have happened,
making war idiotic for anyone else.
Armenia and Ethiopia.
For a variety of reasons which I mentioned in a previous video, the international scene is showing immense tension. The possibility for any of many wars breaking out in the near future is going up. This is a video to talk about the possible flashpoints for a conflict in the next 15 to 20 years. I'm not expecting all of these wars to break out, and some won't happen in the 2020s or 30s, with this video awkwardly stretching in parts to mid-century, but it's the best we can do when predicting the future. This expects to make a general overview of the highest possibilities for conflicts. A lot of the specific
Well, I do think that a lot of wars are going to be happening.
That how these wars would be fought and who would win, I'll cover in a future video about World War III. So with that done, let's start.
Yo, as long as there isn't any war in Mexico, I'm good, bro.
The world today is an absolutely fascinating place, and one that's in flux at that. It's really hard to keep track of all the various currents taking place because everything is moving so fast.
Yep.
Should we be focusing on China, the Middle East, the US election, or Africa? Well, Magellan TV is a great start.
Oh.
Founded by film section, Bunyai, on life in these Thailand is the world to compatible with worries me the most.
Water crisis. Shit.
This is the one that worries me the most. As global population, and especially people's standards for quality of life around the world, rise, tensions over resources is basically inevitable. This is compounded by global warming, which in gross simplification
I'll go to Switzerland if anything happens. Dude, you're from Austria, right? Oh, dude, you have it so good, bro.
makes the Arctic wetter while the tropics drier, resulting in more water scarcity in some very populated regions. Of all the topics involved here, water wars tend to be the most intractable and the most likely, since, in general, for the countries involved, the water is an existential issue they're willing to die over. As upriver nations
Germany,
the rivers,
that's
under
correct.
most
I
circumstances,
think I always say
a
you're
war
from
is very
Austria, my
likely
man, but
unless
no.
there's some variable I can't see. This amounts to an issue of survival for many of the downriver nations, which will do anything and everything to keep what often amounts to their only water supply. If a
It's still
downriver
pretty close
nation
to
loses their water
Switzerland, though.
supply, they effectively lose their independence at best and at worst are simply erased from existence. The first example of a war like this is the Ethiopia-Egypt water dispute. Ethiopia is building
The
the
Nile.
Renaissance Dam to block up the Blue Nile, blocking Egypt's water supply. Just for some statistics, Egypt is 95% dependent on the Nile for its water supply, and so the
Yeah, this map shows you how bad the situation is. Not only all the green areas, but all the population centers are around the Nile. I feel like a lot of Europeans would want to flee Switzerland though, so I don't know how many they'd let in. Germany getting confused with Austria is a new one. It's usually the other way around. Yeah, this is very
percent
scary. I
decline in the
agree.
Nile's river water that's projected could see Egyptian farmland outside the delta decline by 30% and in the delta by a quarter. Hydropower losses could be up to 30%. Some studies show a 46% decline in agricultural land as a relatively
Sadly, I don't think independence is enough a reason to stop a war. There was independence prior to the world wars. People also fight for fear, pride, distracting their population, revenge, etc.
plausible option.
The situation
this
is
a
not
country
getting
where
better.
a significant percentage
Yeah.
of the population are subsistence farmers.
Gosh,
Ethiopia's
dude,
incentive
we're so-
here is that
we're
this
so
dam would
fucked.
provide enough cheap energy to power the entire nation of Ethiopia, as well as much of Sudan. In fact, bribing Sudan with electricity, the next nation downriver by the Nile, is what resulted in Sudan siding with Ethiopia in this issue against Egypt. Similarly, Sudan is much less dependent on the Nile
On the
due to a
Nile, yeah, they do
combination
have
of
water.
natural higher rainfalls and aquifers. There is an element of a proxy war here, with Iran and Turkey
Saudi
supporting
Arabia?
Ethiopia, while Israel, the Gulf Arab states, and Saudi Arabia are Egyptian allies. In a direct war, none of these nations would likely get directly involved. At the end of August, Egypt and Ethiopia failed to reach an agreement, which means Ethiopia will press ahead without compromise from Egypt. This has resulted in the US pulling aid out of Ethiopia, which was more of a Chinese ally anyway. Neither of these countries are world powers, and thus are under the influence of
Okay.
the great power.
Okay, I'm willing to admit this, all right? In this type of scenarios where China enforces more of its power, I'd be willing to say that the West declining in influence is a bad thing, all right? Egypt have said that if this happened, they would blow the thing. Holy
Powers.
no.
Ethiopia would
And now
probably
Ethiopia is
stop
having a
building
big
the
civil
dam if
war
China,
between ethnic
their
groups.
paymaster,
Egypt is very
bullied them
lucky
enough,
for
but
now.
China doesn't have
Yeah.
a reason to do this.
For now.
Also, Ethiopia is experiencing immense internal issues, with a good possibility
And now
of
blew up into a civil
in
war.
the near future. With the rebellion of the Tigray tribal group, which would delay or
Holy shit, you guys were right. He predicted. He was talking about the issues Ethiopia has, and now civil war.
prevent this issue for a good while.
Damn.
Egypt, with its historically abysmal military, and which currently has absolutely no military projection ability to fight across Sudan and Ethiopia, would lose the war. Ethiopia is also a mountainous country with a reputation for being difficult to conquer and the people really hard fighters. If the Nile is dammed up, it would be the worst humanitarian crisis in history. Egypt has a population of 100 million, and
Oh
even if
God.
2%, a ridiculously conservative number, were to be displaced, then that would already be one of the bigger refugee crises in history. If the more probable number of around 30 million would be displaced, that would be a crisis large enough to completely change European civilization.
Wow.
Europe would have to become anti-immigration and completely change its ideology or stop existing. The second region with water-based politics is the Tigris and Euphrates, which flows through Iraq from the headwaters in Turkey.
Oh my God. I forgot, dude. I thought he was only gonna like the only water war was gonna be between Egypt and Ethiopia, but there's more. I thought the Egypt and Ethiopia and Sudan war was really bad, but now there's Turkey, Syria, and Iraq.
Turkey is currently damming both of these
Oh,
rivers,
dude.
which, like Egypt, Iraq is practically entirely dependent upon. In my live streams, I've said many times before that I think Turkey will be a great power in the
Oh,
future.
oh.
Turkey is currently expanding in every direction, and Iraq is likely part of this.
Yeah, and if I'm not mistaken, a lot of the problems with Greece is that all of these islands, or most of them, are part of Greece. But Turkey doesn't support that, especially because they want to expand their maritime border, that it's incredibly small right now.
Control of these rivers would grant the Turks control over this entire region, which historically isn't that surprising, since this region has always been
Yo,
controlled by
Turkey's
massive
fucked up,
multi-ethnic
yeah.
empires, with the Turks controlling Iraq for the vast majority of the last 1,000 years. This, in fact,
The
isn't that
Ottomans?
different from the general principle of irrigation empires, but on a broader scale. Irrigation societies are nearly always god king aristocracies with grinding poverty for the vast majority of the population, with the single river basin united, since whoever controls the centralized water system has control over the entire region and can starve any dissidents of water. However, this time, rather than being the god kings of Sumer or Akkad, the people in charge of the water are the Turks.
It's
Moving
Turks.
east, another region to worry
Oh.
about for water wars is Central Asia. Tajikistan is damming up Uzbekistan, another desert nation's water. Central Asia is really interesting in that it's a competing battleground between Russian, Chinese, Islamist, and local authoritarian interest groups. However, the overriding variable is the doubling of
Oh,
population
dude, this is bad. And now everything that you guys have told me about Kazakhstan.
since 1990, which creates immense pressures upon the local environment. This is combined with the drying up of the Aral Sea, which has further desertified the local environment. This is combined with stagnant economic growth and a brutally oppressive political system. Of all the areas in the world, I'm most worried about Central Asia, in which all these variables coalesce. Something very bad will happen.
Oh, no, dude. Turkmenistan is the most insane and funny dictator. Yeah, I think I've heard something about the Turkmenistan dictatorship. The guy, I think, has a statue made of gold that rotates with the sun. It is insane. But this is bad. The Kazakhstan
Soon in
conflict, it's
Central
becoming
Asia. I
true,
just
man.
don't know what. I've heard some scenarios in which Uzbekistan would take the gloves off, conquer much less populous Tajikistan in order to secure their water supply, and then become a regional hegemon based around the greater Uzbek identity. This is possible.
Russia's gonna
Uzbekistan
be
is
involved.
militarily, demographically, and logistically far ahead of its neighbors, but I'm not sure it's enough to pull it off. An issue with that is that Uzbekistan, being at the center of the map, if it decided to become a great power, would provoke the wrath of China, Russia, and possibly a more powerful future version of Iran, who would crush them, which brings another possibility that this region gets cannibalized by one of the great
A Chinese imperialist's dream.
powers. An equally plausible scenario
I need one of those statues.
was one in which the whole region collapses into chaos, sort of like the Middle East before 2011, given that, in abstract, the conditions are remarkably similar between the two given situations. The fourth, and in my opinion, by far the most horrifying and deadly water war is that between India and China, in which the Chinese are building
I've
300
heard about
dams
this.
in their border with India in the Himalaya mountains in order to strangle India's source of the Ganges and Brahmaputra rivers. China's not willing to negotiate on this, and 1 billion people are dependent on these rivers, meaning this is an absolutely horrifying prospect lingering over us.
1 billion
large portion
people.
of this comes from a Chinese position of weakness, with Much of the north of China projected to run out of
Uzbekistan is the largest and most powerful country in Central Asia, so it could conquer its neighbors if it wanted to. Brain for Breakfast has a good video on that.
water in 2030. The North Chinese Plain is actually relatively well watered, all things considered. However, this is more caused by the massive water needs of their industrial sector and the amount of their water that's polluted afterwards. However, if China can secure India's water and doesn't just cut it, they could basically use it as a bargaining chip against the Indians to effectively
Really? Not
turn India into a
Kazakhstan?
Chinese
Yeah,
puppet
Kazakhstan
state.
seems to be the
Chinese have
larger
done
one.
wonderful geopolitical work with surrounding India. Pakistan, Nepal, Burma, Sri Lanka, and Iran are all now Chinese allies of some flavor.
Don't forget about little Bhutan here at the middle,
India
neutral.
is the only anti-Chinese holdout in South Asia, and thus, if it falls, it will effectively give China control over the vast majority of the continent of Asia. India is also an American ally, and if India and China were to get into a war over the water, America, knowing that India by itself would lose a war against China very badly,
Would get
side
involved.
with India in order to keep India strong and thus prevent Chinese hegemony over Asia. An Indian-Chinese water war could easily become a world war, not to mention just how brutally horrifying this war would be. For example, India and China are both...
Yeah, this is horrible. We're talking about the two most populous countries on Earth, potentially involved in places like the US and Russia. This could become a world war. I think Uzbekistan has the twice the population of Kazakhstan. Yeah, Kazakhstan is powerful, but it really isn't independent. So I won't do anything without Russia's permission and support.
nuclear powers,
I would agree
and
with that.
combined have populations larger than the entire worlds during World War II. The casualties would easily be the worst in history of
Yeah.
any war.
Aging wars. Okay,
In the
interesting.
centuries to come, Russia and China's decades of communism will be seen as a major turning point in history, since it wrought long-term shifts to both nations that will effectively become time bombs unless dealt with. A really big one of these is demographics. Communism was very effective
Yep.
at keeping nations poor while lowering their birth rates. You've seen this under every area that was under communist control for more than a couple decades. For example, under Stalin's reign, Russia's average birth rate per woman
Wow.
went from 6.5 children to 2.8 and then went beneath replacement levels in the 70s. Similarly,
Wow.
China's one-child policy resulted in a horrifying situation of halving every generation. You see, the correlation between urbanization and birth rate is pretty high. Once societies get more urban, people have less kids. In general, this results in the wealthy nations having older populations, but at the same time
You have to know that whaitifalthist really hates communism. Yeah, it shows.
and being rich enough to support them better. Communism did the foolhardy thing of prematurely forcing people off the farms into the cities while the economy was still poor, which resulted in poor and old societies. For example, the average American from a wealthy country is younger than the average Russian or Chinese person, much poorer countries.
Yeah.
The politics of aging are that the elderly are effectively a societal drain that they consume and don't produce, while the young are the opposite. But when the young reach a certain critical mass, political instability results. In recent years, Europe's geopolitical impotence and the Middle East's endless civil wars have much to do with the politics of aging. However, the Russian and Chinese elites know that they only have so much time to act before their populations
Yeah,
become
and I think this is a reason why both China and Russia have acted so aggressively over the past few years, and especially now that we are seeing, especially Russia being incredibly aggressive on its political matters. We are seeing it with Ukraine. We are literally, as we're speaking, this is happening in Kazakhstan.
so elderly,
yeah,
they won't have enough
gosh.
young people to have effective military states. In China, this is even more acute in that the Chinese economy is dependent upon its cheap labor that it exports to the rest of the world. China is dangerously close to reaching the middle income trap, in which one isn't rich enough to be a domestic consumption-based economy, and not poor enough to use cheap labor as an advantage in the global
Yep.
marketplace, with an aging population, which is the worst possible combination.
Yeah.
Russia, meanwhile, is situated in a flat plain with no defensible boundaries, and thus must use its size in of itself
Yeah, Russia and China need to expand before their populations become too old to do anything. It's either that or accepting immigrants.
as its biggest advantage.
Which, I don't know.
Russia has always used its massive population as cannon fodder to make up for its lack of defensible borders, but what happens once Russia's population is neither large nor young? This is why Russia and China are currently acting so aggressively. Both know they have a limited time frame to become stakeholders in the global system in order to start racking in the rent before their retirements kick in. Expect Russia to act very recklessly in the years to come. The
Oh,
current Belarus crisis is the perfect opportunity in which the discrediting Lukashenko creates the perfect opportunity for Putin to step in and bring order, which would
but Europe is also old, so I don't really get it. Yeah, but Europe is accepting a lot of immigrants that I know this is a controversial issue, but eventually they will become integrated to the native population. While places like Russia and China don't accept any. So I think that's why it's different.
have him enact the planned union state between Belarus and Russia. I don't think Russia will have a war with
Every country population are getting old, like immigrants from where? No, that's not necessarily true. I mean, yeah, every population is getting old, but not at the same level. Like Africa and the Middle East for Europe and Latin America for the United States.
Europe. But if it were to be caused by anything, it would be an aggressive Russian action resulting in a miscommunication that would
Yeah, I do actually think that France has one of the highest fertility rates in Europe. Yeah, but who would want to immigrate to these autocratic poor dictatorships? The US will always be able to accept immigration from Latin America, where but who wants to wear immigrants to Russia and China? Russia has 702 Tajik workers. That's actually the biggest export of Tajiks to their workforce. But that is true, Michael. Like I think you're right. Not a lot of well, I mean, I think a lot of people would prefer to go to China despite being a dictatorship because the situation is so much better in China than in their country. It's like, for example, here in Mexico, uh, people from Haiti are staying here and are immigrating to Mexico. Mexico is a dangerous, poor place, but at the end of the day, it's better than Haiti. So they're saying, you know what? Well, fuck it. Same from Latin America. Look at Mexican natality now. It's true, but it's getting old, but it's getting better than the U.S.
spiral into war due to Russia's desperation. Much of China's Belt and Road is to create a young subject population across Asia that they can sell goods to. As China's population ages, it can sell goods to the developing
To
young
Africa, for
populations
example.
across Asia and Africa. Or at least that's the plan. China is completely dependent upon food, natural resource, and oil supplies that come by sea, almost all of which come through the Straits of Malacca. This means the Americans, as the preeminent naval power, basically have a trump card. A big reason the Chinese are
Trump
trying to
card.
build the Belt and Road is in order to create a land-based order by which they can transport everything they need, such as food and oil, by land over Central Asia rather than by sea. A big issue here is that if China can actually find a way to knit Asia together by land, it will unite a majority of the human race. This would be a death blow to the American-European naval-based world system, which
True.
carries the vast majority of the world's trade. There is a precedent to this, where for the vast majority of history, the center of the world wasn't the oceans, but Eurasia, and so a return to this wouldn't be abnormal. Whether China can become or survive as a great power is in a large part determined upon whether it can build this Eurasian trade alliance before their aging crushes them. The Chinese elite
True. This is going to be a nice challenge. And I think that's a good way to solve the age problem, but it's still not going to solve some of the other problems that China's going to
knows
have.
this, and that's where the danger lies. Africa has the exact opposite issue of this, in that they have had massive population growth and a young population with borders that make no sense, entrenched self-serving elites, and not enough economic growth to justify it all. If this sounds familiar, it's what's resulted in the last 10 years of death in the Middle East, but Africa has all the issues above, but worse. I mean, you just can't look at projections that say stuff like Lagos in Nigeria is supposed to have a population of 30 million in 2050 in a country with practically no infrastructure, exports to pay for the food, or effective supply chains. The massive slums that would
The only developed country with a birth rate above replacement levels is Israel. It's stuck to cultural pleasures, fear of being outpopulated by neighboring Arabs, and free eventual treatment. Israel's conditions can't be copied as easily as
Kurd
by
is a
yeah,
perfect
that's
breeding
true.
ground for disease
You
and
can't really
political
copy
radicalism.
culture.
When you see this across the whole continent writ large, a continent with declining amounts of water due to climate change, and without the economic or systemic growth to support the numbers involved, you have a catastrophe waiting. I'm just not
Yeah.
sure if this will strike in the 2020s or 2030s.
Thucydides traps.
There's this idea of Thucydides' trap, by which the dominant power will
Thucydides
try to
or
crush the
Thucydides.
rising one before the rising one becomes powerful enough to overpower the dominant one. The quintessential example of this is the Peloponnesian War, in which the war broke out since Athens was developing quickly and would overtake Sparta unless Sparta did something first. In the
All
book
right.
by Graham Allison of the same name, 15 examples of it were shown in the last 500 years of European history. 12 resulted in a war. It's often used as a tool to describe the US's relationship with China, by which China gets more powerful by the day while the US stagnates by comparison. This means that it's inside the US's self-interest to crush China before it gets significantly more powerful enough to threaten the United States.
Again, I still believe that China will crush China. Okay, that's important. I strongly believe in that.
This
In
has
what?
validity,
In what
but
Philip
another way of
Philip
looking
is
at it
saying?
is from the perspective of the previous section, by which China will be crushed by aging population while the US has stable population growth. The issue we run into here, and we've faced before in the history of the world, is that, like high school, the nations and people's insecurity often have little knowledge of others' insecurities and weaknesses. The prime historical example of this was before World War I, in
The
which
trap
the British and
theory.
French were worried that the Germans would overtake them if they did nothing, while the Germans were worried that the Russians would overtake them if they did nothing. Meanwhile, the Russians and Austrians were worried that if they did nothing, their empires would get torn apart by modernization and ethnic nationalism.
And they did.
This resulted in mass insecurities and recklessness on the part of European governments, which resulted in the First World War. People fail to realize that the First World War didn't start due to chance or madness. It was a series of tiny rational decisions of self-preservation that collectively killed everyone. A very similar issue is occurring today in that the Japanese, Indians, Americans,
Admiral Akbar enters the
and
chat.
Vietnamese are worried that if they do nothing, they will be crushed by China. Similarly, the Chinese and Russians have the population insecurity mentioned above. Under similar circumstances, the Turks know that they're in a region with massive aging populations and decaying economies. With their young and booming economy, they can start throwing their weight around in a big way. North Korea is the apex of this. Their regime knows it's a relic of another age living on borrowed time, and so is desperately trying to invest in nuclear weapons in order to bully the outside world into concessions that will keep itself alive for a few years more. North Korea, meanwhile, is a Chinese ally, and so if the Americans were to invade it, it would result in American troops on the Chinese border. This would be unacceptable to Beijing, and we all know what happened last time that happened in the 50s. In its immense weakness, North Korea is a major danger to the geopolitical world. There is a very different kind of time pressure that's created by the sudden rise of coronavirus. For reasons explained in the previous video, most of the world's population was barely getting by due to the rising cost of living. When this was compounded by the COVID economic crisis, it created massive, desperate populations.
Yeah.
Desperate populations have historically tended to go...
And now, the US and a lot of parts in the world are dealing with supply chain issues.
...to two directions, either towards
better.
internal strife or external wars. Governments often turn to external opponents in order to unite the nation, or try to use war as a way of changing the rules of the international system to their favor in order to make their populations wealthier and their countries more powerful. The incentive to do this rises as internal strife grows. China is very much the apex of this, in that the reason the Chinese Communist Party continues to rule China while communism collapsed everywhere else was since the communists made an implicit deal with the Chinese people, by which, in exchange for higher wages and a better standard of living, the Chinese people would agree to accept all the repression and corruption. With the economic slowdown incurred by the trade war and coronavirus, this basically destroys the raison d'etre for the communist regime.
Whoa.
For example, China has stopped pushing for their Made in China 2025 initiative, which was effectively based upon stealing Western technology and using it to make their economy a high-tech and quality production center, since the West cracked down on Chinese technological theft, thus making the plan untenable. This is likely part of the reason that China is currently going through a new wave of repression and trying to instigate ideological fervor, and that they're trying to keep their population under control after they stop providing their side of the deal.
This is also going to be very interesting in the future. How China is able to control its own population. An interesting
It
take.
sounds really
An interesting take is that maybe China will simply invade North Korea and annex it themselves if North Korea collapses in order to prevent American and Japanese troops from advancing. That is an interesting take. That I could see that happening actually. Just annex North Korea because they can. The big threat to North Korea might be, ironically, China. I agree.
rich coming from an American, but the era of American hegemony has been the greatest age in history. I don't mean to be chauvinistic, but no matter what metric you look at, whether nutrition, health, literacy, personal freedom, peace, wealth, or national self-determination, it's writ large. This is since the US has agreed to protect a huge number of countries from
Wow, countries the US is legally obligated to defend. So pretty much every single country in the Americas except for Venezuela and Cuba. We have every single Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Mexico. Almost all of Europe except for Ireland, Switzerland, Sweden, Finland, and some of the Balkans. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Japan. So yeah, a lot of countries.
conquest,
American
which has
moment.
incentivized countries to
America.
work together rather than conquer and oppress each other. Meanwhile, the US policed the entire world's oceans, thus opening up the entire world to cheap and safe oceanic commerce. The US did accrue many benefits from this, like cheap credit, but these disproportionately helped the American upper classes and
American
hurt
moment.
the American middle class, which was hollowed out by competition with cheaper foreign workers. American industry and society was hurt by the US creating a world system with which everyone had free trade with America, but most of the world kept tariffs against America. Since those who benefited from the American world system inside America were greatly outnumbered by those who didn't, we're seeing a revolt from inside America against that very system.
Bernie.
America feels the need to renegotiate its position of power around the world. What most foreigners don't understand is that America really doesn't need the rest of the world. America has a rate of dependency on the rest of the world's economy similar to countries like Sudan, Ethiopia, or Cuba. The US is a net exporter in oil, food, industrial goods, and basically any other material you can think of. Over the next 20 or 30 years, we'll see the total US removal of power from areas like the Middle East, whose oil the US no longer
This has happened in Afghanistan. We already saw US troops getting out of Afghanistan.
needs, and the rest of the world, except the first world areas that are wealthy enough for the U.S. to continue to justify maintaining influence over
Okay,
them.
so these are the American influence areas. We have the European sphere, the Pacific sphere of influence, the American neighborhood. That's that's Canada and Mexico, and the Southern Cone, periodic American interventions. Yeah.
The U.S. will no longer protect the whole world's oceanic traffic in the way it used to.
Yep,
I'm
that
guessing
is
the
true.
U.S. will stay in areas like Europe or the Far East, but the U.S. is sick of losing money on maintaining troops in other continents.
In Africa or the
This
Middle
will
East.
either result in the U.S. starting to take tribute from these regions in one form or another in exchange for America's protection, or these countries start expanding their own militaries. This would start to weaken American control of these regions, once the French and Germans start to very good
And troops started to leave Syria, but the generals lied to Trump and didn't remove all U.S. troops from the country.
militaries. How willing to listen to America will they be? Another thing to consider is that the only way the US feel to win a war against Russia or China would be by arming the Japanese, Germans, and Turks to the teeth against them.
Let's go,
Arming
France.
and militarizing these nations would change geopolitics in too big a way to describe. America's removal would create an immense power vacuum in much of the world. Most African countries, for example, have absolutely terrible militaries, and the only way they haven't been recolonized, collapsed into different countries, or cannibalized each other is that the
I don't know. Maybe Africa should be recolonized, dude. Interested, what would happen to the Middle East when renewables are the dominant energy source? Probably
World
nothing good.
system will crush anyone who does so.
I mean, I think a lot of the oil rich nations like the Gulf states of Qatar, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia are investing a little bit more. I mean, we're seeing it with the United Arab Emirates and Dubai. They are trying to get more revenue from tourism or other financial sectors. So they are diversifying,
That will
maybe.
then. Also, in areas where the countries are weak and have little reason to exist
Countries
besides a
that only
European
exist since a
diplomat said
European
so,
diplomat
they'll
said
be
so.
gone. Turkey and Iran secondarily, as powerful, industrialized, populous, and militarized countries that sit in the middle
A
of this.
second Ottoman Empire, possible sphere of influence for Turkey in 2055. So we got Central Asia, the Caucasus, some parts of the Southern Balkans, the Middle East.
Will benefit enormously and build large
Algeria is a good example of a failed state. I don't know much about
when
Algeria,
America stops caring.
other than its
Similarly,
independence
with
war,
America no longer protecting Europe's
Hey,
oil
let's go,
interests, you would
France.
see European countries, with the prime example being France, Western Europe's most active military power, who already has lots of influence in West Africa, recolonizing or spreading influence in Africa in order to gain the oil and other resources America's no longer willing to foot the bill for. Well, that was a dark video.
France
If you
W
liked
again.
it, please like, comment, subscribe, or
Make France great again. Oh my god, this was a dark video, dude. Holy shit. Why did France leave Algeria? I'm not entirely sure. Didn't want I think if I'm not mistaken, France didn't want to leave Algeria. But they fought some sort of war, civil war, independence war. I think China is just going to keep North Korea as a buffer state that only makes empty threats, and in exchange allow North Korean trade to keep going through Chinese ports. Probably true. Gosh, dude. We did. It's very complicated. Yeah, it is. Oh my god. His next interesting geopolitics video, it's the 5 countries collapse. The World War III video is kind of boring. We're talking about a coup d'etat, civil war, etc. Yeah, let's probably finish this stream that's with the civil, sorry, with the 5 countries collapse. How long is it? How long have we streamed? We've been on air for like 2.5 hours. De Gaulle really didn't want to leave, but then he died. Yeah. Charles de Gaulle. All right, yeah, let's finish with this. Oh, where is out? There it is.
Much to most people in wealthier countries' surprise, the last 30 years have been the third world's golden age. Global poverty has been halved, and the average African now has the same lifespan as the average European did in 1950. By nearly every metric, most third world nations have seen remarkable growth.
No, what the hell
For
are
a
you talking
variety
about?
of reasons, I think this will come to a screeching halt in the years to come. In this series of videos I've been making about geopolitics, I've been talking about the coming contraction of the global system. In this series, I've talked mostly about
De Gaulle was still in power in 68 and he left Algeria in 62.
the wealthier and more powerful countries like China or America, ignoring the poorer ones. Well, this video is to rectify this. We're looking at the 5 third world countries I think will collapse in the next 20 years. If a third world country is too small and poor, it's not getting on this list because it doesn't matter to the international system if it collapses. Can any of you really tell
If I'm not mistaken, didn't France wanted to like make Algeria a part of France?
me if Sierra Leone or the Central African Republic are currently in a civil war? No Googling, that's cheating. Exactly, my point. This list also doesn't have wealthy countries like Canada or the UK that have a decent chance of splitting up, because this would almost certainly be a peaceful and controlled process and not a collapse. This video partially exists since I predicted 2.5 wars this fall alone, and so I don't want to get left out of the action if 2021 turns out to be a worse year than 2020. I just hope to God I'm wrong.
Algeria was a part of France. Oh.
One can't talk about unstable nations without talking about North Korea. North Korea boggles the mind with how it continues to exist in the modern world. It's a horrifically repressive and evil Stalinistic regime. In fact, I was just watching an interesting documentary about North Korea called Kim Jong-un, the Unauthorized Biography. It goes through the hidden logic behind totalitarianism in a fascinating way. I was able to watch this through this video's sponsor, Magellan TV, a documentary streaming service with all sorts of content like geopolitics, and get one free gift card, so you can share on TV for free. Even
Bro, I am a Pied Noir. What's a Pied Noir? Feel bad about the people of North Korea, man? Yeah. Yeah, some of the poorest, most oppressed people in the world. You gotta feel really bad for them.
a couple factors are going to weaken the international system in the third world. The first of which is that most borders in the third world don't make any sense. Many of them were drawn by European diplomats who didn't think these countries would get independence for several hundred years at least. When these countries got independence, the borders made little sense ethnically or geographically.
All right, guys, let's settle this. All right. In 1959, Charles de Gaulle declared that the Algerians had the right to determine their own future, despite terrorist attacks by French Algerians opposed to independence and French elements. An agreement was signed in 1962, and Algeria became independent. Some thought that he supported French Algeria, others that he only recognized the equality of the rights between all, or some the independence of the country. Finally, de Gaulle accepts. French settler in North Africa before independence, we were in 2 million. Okay, yeah.
Graphically.
I think the
Similarly,
truth
the
is
West
somewhere
tried
in
to
the middle.
transpose nation-states into areas where they made no sense. Most of history has been dominated either by tribal confederacies or giant multi-ethnic empires. The nation-state, like France or Germany, is in many ways a peculiar creation of European history. These nonsensical third world countries survived so long since so many countries were invaded in World War II that the consensus became that conquering your neighbors or splitting countries up really wasn't okay. This was promulgated by the UN, who became a club mainly of countries that shouldn't logically exist, who voted as a single bloc with the US as its fist. The US supported all these countries that shouldn't exist since it worried that if they didn't, they'd go Soviet. This was a rational worry since most of the first generation of these post-colonial dictators were trained in Western universities by Marxists alongside disliking their former Western colonial
countries that have tried some variation of socialism in the third world, normally with a great deal of variation between Marxist, Stalinist, or Maoist doctrines.
masters, and thus had a natural Soviet
that's
bias.
a lot.
As of now, the US is pulling away from this. North America is now the biggest oil exporter in the world, and America is bringing industry back, meaning that the US really has less and less reason to deal with the rest of the world at all. The US will likely stay in its wealthy allied areas like Western Europe and the Far East, but neither the Republicans nor the Democrats have agendas that involve much action in Africa or continental Asia. In other words, the main force that held the international order together is leaving these areas. The second reason is that as the global boomer generation ages, capital will shrink markedly. Aging affects the nation's economic system profoundly, with younger populations consuming more as young people buy homes, raise kids, etc. These economies need capital but generate lots of growth, and this was manifested in the massive economic growth in first world nations from 1950 to 1990 as the boomer generation was young. Middle-aged populations save up for retirement, and this works mainly in the form of investment. The boomers had children at much lower rates than their parents, and so they had more capital to put in the stock market since they weren't putting it into kids. This money flooded the third world when the boomers were in their middle age, between 1990 and 2020, which resulted in massive amounts of capital that allowed these countries to grow. Brazil, China, and India's economies have all been able to grow because your aunt was saving up for retirement. Aging populations are just drains, and they've all been able to grow because your aunt was saving.
This audience is overwhelmingly young and Western, so I feel relatively secure with this
Getting up for
overgeneralization.
retirement. Aging populations are just drains, and the entire first world, with the exception of the US and a handful of other countries such as New Zealand, Sweden, and France, is expected to age really harshly in the decades to come. The money that's been supporting the third world will go into providing geriatric care for the Canadian, Japanese, and German elderly. If you want to read about the effects of aging upon international capital, or of the US deciding to become less of a global policeman, Peter Zehan's book Disunited Nations is a great guide. The third reason is that long periods of population and economic growth presage eras of conflict and internal collapse. This is since as the population goes up, the value of wage labor goes down. Similarly, as the amount
Whoa.
of capital rises, the size of the upper class grows larger than its own ability to sustain itself, and income inequality swells, resulting in massive internal social tension. Peter Turchin's Secular Cycles is a great book about this. Countries that are halfway through industrialization are especially prone to this. This is why Germany had a revolution in 1850, Russia in 1920, and America in 1860, since early stage industrialization promotes all the things above that lead to a lack of social cohesion. Late stage industrial societies tend to be remarkably stable, however. Much of the Third World is an early stage industrialization. Similarly, the Third World has gone through unprecedented economic and demographic growth and a rise in inequality, even if the common person has also been doing better. For countries that haven't industrialized at all or have barely done so, population growth is even more traumatic. It results in Malthusian pressures as peasants are divided into smaller and smaller plots of land. Urbanization and industry lets off a good amount of this pressure, and this was a big driving reason for the Second Congo War, or the bloodiest war since World War II, and the wave of African wars in the 1990s in general. The fourth reason is global warming. Lots of the world, and areas that are very densely populated, face drying and warming climates. I talk a lot about this in my Wars of the 2020s video, with the growing potential for water wars. However, this also serves to
What
create
is the name of the video we are watching? It's 5 countries that will collapse by 2040.
political instability. The fifth reason is that basically every Western nation is shutting down immigration from these countries. Emigration was great for unstable third world nations, since it produced a safety valve for the most discontented, talented, and organized people, alongside lessening population pressures in general. Without this, these people will stay at home, get angry at their governments, and start revolutions. So, starting from there, let's keep these 5 factors of declining American influence, lowering amounts of global capital, population and climatic pressures, as well as declining emigration to see how it'll affect these 5 countries. By the way, these countries aren't in any particular order, so don't overanalyze that. Number 1, Egypt. If I had to
Oh,
say any one of these countries is an obvious prediction, it would be this one.
really?
Egypt has so many issues that it's difficult to keep track of them all. Firstly, and most importantly, Ethiopia is stealing their water supply. Ethiopia is building the Renaissance Dam to block off the Blue Nile, which could cut Egypt's amount of air.
The Second Congo War is a very bloody war that nobody knows about. It's the deadliest war since World War II. Yeah, I think I do know a little bit about it, but definitely not as much as I should.
Land by between 1/3 and 40%. Remember, this is a nation where a quarter of the population works in agriculture. It's highly likely Egypt will have a war with Ethiopia and Sudan, its ally over the water in the
And
decades
it's gonna
to come.
lose.
A war which Egypt will likely lose. I covered this in my Wars of the 2020s video. Egypt is also stuck in a nasty economic situation. Although Egypt's economy has been growing, its population's been growing even faster. Egypt's population has gone from 70 million in 2000 to 100 million today. The percent living off less than $1 a
5
day in
million
2018
deaths.
before
Wow.
coronavirus, let me remind you, was at 32.5%, up from 27.8% in 2015 and 16.7% in 2000. The population has been flooding into the major cities, especially Cairo, which has become completely congested. Cairo's population, already one of the most crowded in the world, is expected to double in the next few decades.
Wow.
Egypt's unemployment rate is also really bad at 13%, before coronavirus again. Unemployment and urbanization is a terrible combination, since it means disgruntled people can easily congregate into mobs.
Yep.
Also, Egypt is the home of the Muslim Brotherhood, and so we could easily see radicalization. The Egyptian government has been dealing with this with a remarkable inability and even crassness that's downright shocking. To get away from the mobs of Cairo, they're currently building a new capital called New Administrative Capital, very imaginative name, out in the desert. The capital will have all sorts of mega projects like massive mosques, museums, amusement parks, and even a water park, in a country starved for water. Similarly, Egypt is
Oh
trying
my
to meddle in
god,
its
dude.
neighbors like Libya. These
What
are
if
really bad signs since it demonstrates the Egyptian elite are out of touch with their population and are even unaware of how precarious their position is. Without knowing there's a problem, they can't fix it. Well, I'm sure on the other hand that the elite have enough in London and Paris bank accounts to live quite comfortably even if Egypt itself falls off a cliff. I see very few ways in which Egypt remains independent in the decades to come. In a historical perspective, this is the norm. From 521 BC to 1951 AD, Egypt was never ruled by a
dynasties of Egypt, Persian, Greek, Roman, Greek, Persian, Arab, Persian, Berber, Kurdish, Chechenian, Turkish, French, Albanian. What the hell? And finally, British. The new capital is looking good though, even if it's a bad move. Yeah,
native
it
dynasty.
definitely looks good.
Egypt will almost certainly collapse
Don't think it's a
internally, and if
great
I had
move.
to guess, it would fall into the hands of one of four powers. The Ethiopians are the ones that make the most geographic sense. They hold Egypt's water hostage. However, Ethiopia itself is in an early stage of industrialization and doesn't have the force projection abilities to hold on to Egypt. Similarly, Egypt has nothing Ethiopia wants. The second option that I think is most likely is the Turks. The Turks are meddling in so many neighboring countries, including neighboring Libya and Somalia even further away, that if Egypt starts to fall apart, the Turks likely intervene. An important variable is the Suez Canal, which Egypt owns, and it needs to stay open for the international system to keep functioning, and so people will intervene to do so. The third power is the United States, the current guarantor of the world system, but one who's stopped caring about this region, and as the 9/11 generation gets more power, will be practically allergic to the Middle East, which brings us to the fourth option, the French, Peninsular Europe's greatest military power, who's an active African and Mediterranean force. By securing the Suez, the French could keep Europe's supply of oil from the Gulf Arab states stable. Before we hit the ad break, I'd like to insert my own personal ad.
Friends
Whaitifalthist has merch. Click the link in the description for Whaitifalthist brands, t-shirts, sweatshirts, maps, and mugs. Buy maps from this show in multiple formats and more inventories coming soon, including the most popular fan-voted phrases. Number 2. South Africa. It's so strange that until pretty recently there was so much optimism about South
They can't keep the capital in Cairo though. Maybe they should be moved the capital to Alexandria, but it still isn't that bad of a move. I think it's not a bad move to move your capital, but I think it's a bad move to build a new one. It's just like it's not that necessary. Yes, I think South Africa will collapse, unfortunately.
South Africa.
The Rainbow
It was
Nation.
considered the Rainbow Nation, a multiracial success story and an African juggernaut. This died. South Africa shares a couple things with Egypt, the first of which is a decline in water supply. Much of the African continent is projected to get drier, with western South Africa projected to be part of this, with the Cape region supposed to lose about 60% of its water by 2070.
Ooh.
However, thank God, the more populated eastern part of the country is projected to get wetter. It also shares growing population and growing poverty, with the population going from 45 to 57 million over the last 20 years, which is honestly better than a lot of third world countries. However, poverty rates have gone up, currently at 16%, with urban poverty getting worse over the last few years, while rural has stagnated or improved. South Africa's unemployment was at a horrific 28% before COVID. The biggest issue is South Africa's racial and ethnic tensions.
Oh, dude, the racial tensions. Fuck, dude. They have to expand into the desert eventually. The Nile can hold their growing population. True. Yeah, I have an online friend from South Africa. He's not optimistic about the country. I also have a friend from South Africa, and she is white, and she's looking to get out of the country.
Which coincide heavily with inequality.
And again,
South Africa is the most
unequal. And hey, I'm a liberal, okay? So I'm not. It's not about a racial thing for me, but
nation on Earth, and this has gotten
it's
even
just
worse.
bad. It's
median black income
horrible.
has increased by 15% over the last 20 years, but this has almost certainly been eaten up by the greater cost of urban living. The vast majority of South Africa's income growth has gone to a few very rich whites. South Africa is strange that the fortunes and businesses are controlled by a tiny white elite, but practically the entire government is black. Partially, this economic difference is due to centuries of racist practices on the part of the whites, but Also, since an industrial European civilization
Yeah, you can't deny all the centuries of apartheid uh, contributed to this change. Uh, all of this also compounded by climate change, which is affecting all of this. Yeah, climate change is just making all of this much worse. 35% of people with no job in South Africa. That's horrible. I have family who are living in South Africa. They want to leave and move back to Britain. Yeah, it's a smart move. Tell your family members that might be a good idea.
rammed into an illiterate Iron Age one. Unlike
Which
other
is which is really sad though, because South Africa is a really beautiful country. I've never been there, but I've heard it's the nature is astonishingly beautiful.
African countries where all the ethnic groups are relatively equally poor, in South Africa, blacks see whites' wealth and being barely literate, wonder why they can't have it, and think that if they divided it, everyone would be richer. Under these circumstances of massive unemployment and large population growth, it seems more than likely that at a certain point the government takes the land from the whites and divides it among black
This is happening.
smallholders. Or exactly what happened in Zimbabwe under Mugabe. This has been a platform of part of the ANC, or South Africa's black nationalist party that's been in charge since the end of apartheid. Similarly to Zimbabwe, dividing land holdings among black farmers would be a huge failure. Zimbabwe went from being a large food exporter and pretty wealthy to one of the poorest and hungriest countries in the world. This is since the process of dividing the land was often corrupt and given to politically connected, but also a good part since the native
I have an uncle who came over from South Africa in
Africans were
2014.
farming at an Iron Age
Wow.
level, while the whites on an industrial, which cratered productivity. Similarly, if South Africa did this and disrespected property rights that much, white capital and businesses would flee to London, Australia, or America. Under these circumstances of immense economic collapse, South Africa would divide into many parts. This is
Zululand, Lesotho, and Botswana would become bigger. Xhosa land and the Cape. And the bad thing is that the more conflict there is, the more less climate change will be addressed, because you're starving from death or fighting a war. Who cares about climate change? Yeah, that's true. There was massive looting in South Africa last year, which doesn't help their economy.
since South Africa was created by European colonizers for the intention of colonization, and without it, the borders really don't make much sense. You have tribal groups like
Yep.
the Xhosa and Zulu who really should be coherent independent nations. Similarly, you have groups like the Tswana and Sotho who should join their ethnic cousins in Botswana and Lesotho. Cape Town, inhabited by the very ethnically different Cape Coloreds, would make more sense as an independent state. Frankly, the only thing holding South Africa together at this point is inertia. Number 3. Saudi Arabia.
Oh,
My father has a bet going with me that the House of Saud will fall apart before I get married. My fiancée is not happy about this. Just kidding. Having your job being predicting third world civil wars is ranked as one of the most effective birth controls. I stand by his judgment, however. Saudi Arabia
True.
should have never been a country, and the fact that it's still one is shocking. Saudi Arabia might be one of the strangest countries in history. It was a tribal, absolutist monarchy theocracy, one of the last of its kind, and it took over a shit ton of oil right when oil started to be valuable, and right after the European
got lucky.
countries stopped colonizing
Incredibly
areas
lucky.
because they had valuable resources. Thus, we have a country that was reactionary even when it was founded, propounding an interpretation of Islam that even the Prophet Muhammad would have found extreme.
wow.
Similarly, it's
Yeah.
inhabited by tribal groups that have spent all of history killing each other, has a massive, unhappy, unfree migrant worker population, an immense top-heavy welfare
This
state
is also
dependent
true.
upon oil, has very few industries that are not oil-dependent, and has very little of its young population
An interesting part of South Africa is the city of Durban. It's around 25% Indian, and they own most of the businesses in the city. In a collapse, you would see an Indian city in South Africa.
studying the STEM subjects necessary
That
for
is actually pretty
diversifying
interesting.
economy. Similarly, like lots of Arab militaries, the monarchy is more worried at the military being used as a tool against the monarchy than as an actual tool against foreign enemies. The Saudi military has an excellent imperial guard made up of Bedouin tribesmen, and the rest are cannon fodder. Their military has a huge budget, but the situation seems very similar to Saddam Hussein's Iraqi military, where poor leadership, morale, and training renders it useless.
It's gonna wreck that
The
military.
main thing
yeah.
holding this together is the welfare state, funded by their massive oil revenues. Most young Saudi ethnic Arabs work cushy government jobs supported by the oil, while my young Saudi ethnic
Wow,
Arabs
70% of Saudi nationals work government jobs, which average 1 hour of real work a day.
work cushy government
Oh.
jobs supported by the oil while
Shit.
migrant immigrant labor does the unpleasant stuff. Once the oil goes away, Saudi Arabia is screwed. The Saudis know this and they've been trying to diversify their economy, but it's not really working. They're trying to build a $500 billion city in the Red Sea, 33 times larger than New York City, but most sources describe it as an ego trip on Crown Prince bin Salman's part that will turn into a white elephant. The
Dream
Saudis
job,
can produce
yeah.
oil cheaper than
I know,
anyone else,
right?
and so this wouldn't be worrying in of itself, except for their masters. The Americans are leaving them for good. With the U.S. as an oil explorer
Their
and tired of supporting the
masters, holy
Europeans,
shit.
who are the ones who use the Middle East soil, combined with general moral repulsion and bad taste left in their mouth after 9/11, means the Americans are leaving. With the US gone, it makes an Iranian land grab way too easy. Iran, unlike Saudi Arabia, is a much more coherent nation. Similarly, Saudi Arabia's oil-producing regions in the eastern part of the country are both geographically close to Iran and its ally Iraq, but are also majority Shia. Iran is the self-proclaimed protector of the Shia world, and Saudi Arabia is a Sunni theocracy that oppresses them. It doesn't help the land in between is dead flat. Similarly, the Iranians could blockade the Strait of Hormuz,
This could
thus shutting
happen.
down Saudi oil traffic out of the Persian Gulf. If eastern Saudi Arabia, which holds the oil, falls apart, so does the rest of the country, which is held together by the oil system's welfare. Under these circumstances, I could see Turkey, the greatest Sunni power in the world, supporting a faction to protect Mecca and Medina, the holy cities, while the rest of the country falls apart. Number 4, Indonesia. Indonesia should not be a country.
That's
There are
really
over
interesting.
300 languages, and the country is probably way larger than you think. If you stretch one side of Indonesia to the other, it's wider than the continental United States, or goes from roughly London to Kyrgyzstan. The biggest thing that pushes Indonesia apart is its sheer
It's
size.
massive.
Very surprisingly, Indonesia isn't a
That's
great
what she
naval
said,
power
huh?
considering its geographic position. Indonesia had little in common with its disparate parts, the only unifying characteristic being the Dutch colonization. Since then, Jakarta has effectively
The
been
Dutch
a
East
colonial power,
Indies.
trying to hold down a massive empire with separatist movements and
Yeah, Indonesia will collapse. That's something I haven't thought about. Even Saudi Arabia, but South Africa has been the
and
one that
Papua on each extreme.
makes a lot of sense.
Indonesia has one major thing in
Sad
its favor,
Indonesia,
economic
yeah.
growth. Indonesia has seen declines in poverty, which is now down to 9%, and inequality, which has also declined. However, Indonesia is still the fourth most unequal country in the world. However, this is compounded by ethnic divisions of wealth, which are quite poisonous, with Indonesia's Chinese population being 1% of the total population, but controlling 75% of the economy. Big issues for Indonesia are its dependence upon foreign investment, foreign export sales, and its mid-level industrialization, all of which will really hurt it as global capital shrinks and the US places more tariffs. Indonesia is the classic poor nation issue where its population isn't rich enough to buy the stuff they make, since most of the stuff they
The
make
middle
is really
income
low
trap.
on the value-added chain, like t-shirts or exporting raw materials. Other negative factors are weakening the balance of power between Java, where a majority of the population lives, and is one of the smaller of the main islands, and the other much more lightly populated islands. The other major islands are filling up, with rainforest cover collapsing and Java
Wow.
is getting more and more populated.
Talking about climate change, this is just massive amounts of deforesting. Look at 2020. Huge.
Are filling up, with rainforest cover collapsing and Java is getting more and more populated. Indonesia's population went up by 70 million since 2000, which makes me
Wow.
wonder what the rates of rural immiseration are.
Yeah.
Muslims from Java have been immigrating to the other islands, disrupting complex local balances of power and provoking animosity. Similarly, the capital is even moving from Java to Borneo in order to maintain easier control of the provinces. This is also since the previous capital, Jakarta, is also one of the capital cities in the world most threatened by rising sea levels. This is also expanded by rising radical Islam, spurned by Saudi Arabia. Indonesia has traditionally had a moderate interpretation of Islam, but if things go south and if conditions worsen,
It
this
could become more
change.
extreme.
Something important that I think would really improve Indonesia's chances are American and Chinese influence. Indonesia is an American ally as the US is trying to use it to contain China. The Chinese, meanwhile, have great interest in the ethnic Chinese population there. Surprisingly, these two competitors have similar self-interests here, that of stability, and could work together. Neither nation wants to see Indonesia collapse. For this reason,
Speaking of new countries in the future, the East African Federation is very interesting. I've read a little bit about
among
that.
the
It is
one
very
mentioned
interesting.
above about economics, I don't think Indonesia will be a horrific bloodbath. I could see it dividing, however. I think the conflict would be a quick civil war, with parts of the archipelago gaining independence,
I,
with the
I, I don't
process
know if I
shepherded by the
see Indonesia
Americans and
really
Chinese,
dividing,
but I don't think it would be a horrific 30 years
but at
war.
least it wouldn't be a
Number
war, though.
5, North
Yeah,
Korea.
of course,
This
yeah.
one is technically a second, not third world nation, but I think it still stands. This one seems so obvious to me that I'm going to keep it pretty short. North Korea should not have lived this long. It's a Stalinist nation that survived longer than practically any other. The government is the most
And
repressive
he
in the
hates
world, as the people
communism.
live in squalid poverty. It's downright shocking they have survived for the last 30 years, let alone another 20. No one wants to see North Korea continue to exist in its current form except the North Korean government. The main reason North Korea continues.
Yeah, but the East African Federation looks more and more unlikely as the countries refuse to cooperate. Yeah, it's just very hard to keep unions like that. The European Union has seen a lot of issues and it's still seeing a lot of issues. So imagining an East African Federation would be really tough to maintain. When it comes to North Korea,
To
yeah,
exist
they'll
is the sheer
collapse.
force of its military,
I
the
could see
fourth
that.
largest in the world. However, even North Korea knows it's weak and threatened. The whole strategy behind them trying to push for a nuclear bomb is to become powerful enough to bully the rest of the world into
And to
economic
leave them
concessions to keep them
alone.
alive. The Chinese want a unified Korea, and one with South Korea's economic model at that, but they don't want an American ally, which is a big issue. If modern South Korea tried to integrate into the North, that would effectively involve putting American forces, their ally, on the Chinese border, which would be unacceptable. All of these complications mean that the exact method by which North Korea falls is difficult to ascertain and is heavily linked with all the politics around it, but it almost certainly will happen. Well, that was a cheery video. I feel kinda
Ah,
unclean talking about these millions of deaths in third world countries while I live comfortably in my own life. And I really hope none of this comes true, and statistically, I'm far more likely to be wrong than right, so don't treat my word as gospel truth.
but hey, you've been through a lot of times too, my man, especially when it comes to Ethiopia, Armenia, some of the stuff going on in Egypt. So I don't know. What do you guys think? Wow, that was a long stream. Almost three, well, actually, over 3 hours.
Much of sub-Saharan Africa got off this list since I can't see their crisis, caused in large part by overpopulation and climate change, unfolding in the next 20 years. 40 seems more plausible to me.
Yeah.
Nigeria just barely got off the list, since I thought as long as they keep their oil supply pumping, they'll be able to fight off any rebels. Similarly, I thought Brazil would collapse into dilapidated economic recession, but that really wasn't bad enough to get onto the list. Whaitifalthist, and thanks for watching.
War. War never changes. That is true, though. Hope you liked the channel I suggested. Yeah, it was great. I love talking geopolitics. I think it's one of the most interesting things out there on YouTube. It doesn't go too far into politics, like the divisive politics, and it also you get to understand other parts of the world. A very good stream. Thank you, Michael. I'm so glad that you guys liked this stream. I definitely enjoyed doing it. I enjoyed it so much. It lasted over 3 hours, and time honestly flew. But thank you all so much for watching. Geopolitics, I agree, is indeed very epic. And you can support me by either the links on the description or just liking and subscribing to the channel. Thank you guys for the stream. You guys truly made it really interesting. And I'll see you very soon with another video and stream. Take care. Stay safe. Omicron, it's wrecking a big part of the world. And we were a constant 13 people. That is true. Thank you to all the 13 people that commented and just watch the stream in general. You're a very likable guy. Thank you so much, Gustav. I appreciate you. Get Ass, Fritos, Quick History, Philippe Oired9, Michael Tanos, Fabulous Cat, and all the others that commented. Thank you all so much.